Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to World Discussion. This is November the 5th, 2023, and we are here to talk about the world, current events, foreign policy, economics, world history, movies and shows and games, you name it. I'm about to jump into a Discord call with Agent Smith, and we're going to talk about what is going on. I have a list of questions that chat has already provided, but if you want to add some, you can add me in the Twitch chat, and I will do my best to pass that along. Without any further delays, let's begin World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing all right. Trying to keep the chat together. There's a lot of spicy banter going on.
No doubt.
Yeah, and I'll admit it is hard to talk about hyper-violent situations in a way that doesn't get our account in trouble. So,
Yeah.
Thank you, chat, for working with us through these trying times. So yeah, we had pretty good WoW raids this weekend. It's been overall getting back in the groove of things a week. The previous weekend, we didn't have a role discussion because I was out of town in Austin. Went to see Kiss on their final tour. It's one of my dad's favorite bands, and he flew us out and got us like really close-up tickets. They're still alive. They're in their 60s. I'll be honest, they still rock. It's not my kind of music. Like, I wouldn't choose to listen to music of that genre, but they do their craft well, and they are very skilled performers, and they have a super high-budget show with like crazy pyrotechnics. They're like swinging across the room and stuff, regardless of their age. They've got the full face paint stuff on. They've got crazy outfits. There's like fake blood and everything. It's wild. So, yeah.
Well, I'll be damned.
Yeah, I respect it.
I didn't even know they were still around.
They are. They did their final tour before COVID, and then you kind of like back from the dead, like doing another final tour. So I look forward to their next final tour in about 3 years.
That's the spirit.
Mm-hmm. But it was funny because the one weekend that I'm there, there was like a crazy cold front, and it was in the low 40s, high 30s, and raining in Austin. So,
yeah, that's a little uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad that I brought a hoodie. I brought what I thought would be appropriate Texas clothing and shorts and t-shirts, and then it was cold as ass.
Oh, you were down in, Austin, Texas.
Yeah.
Oh, didn't know you were in state.
Yeah. But it was a cool trip. Got to catch up with my dad and my brother. We had a family men time talking about stuff.
Oh, I'm sure that was fun.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Have you made any more progress on Baldur's Gate?
I haven't had the chance to play it this week. I've been trying to catch up on my StarCraft and my Dota.
Gotcha.
Have you played it anymore?
Oh yeah, I'm working on my second playthrough, and I've got a third one that I intermittently pick up now and again. Yeah, it's a very fun game. Lots of different ways to play it.
What character did you make this time?
Second playthrough, it's just a cute paladin.
Nice.
And third playthrough is a rogue halfling. Yeah, I'm trying to do things a lot different with the halfling, because I wanted to try to recruit a character that I didn't even know was recruitable until after my first playthrough.
Oh, which one?
Minthara.
Oh, yeah. Oh, man. Okay, so you're doing an evil playthrough.
Well, I don't want to be too evil, but yeah, I'm going to try to finagle it so that I can get her.
Yeah.
Because I'm quite curious about that. I had no idea. I just, killed her with the rest of them in the first playthrough. So I was quite surprised to find out that there was an additional companion beyond the ones I already had.
Yeah, and that one specifically, there's a compatibility problem with a lot of other ones where if you go the story route where you pick her up, then a bunch of people leave your camp, so.
Yeah, I'm aware. So the third playthrough is definitely going to require some different decisions correspondingly.
Yeah, let me know how that one goes. gotten too far with the evil playthrough. I did the Grove fight, and I've just felt so bad because you fight all those characters where you know how they get to the next town and they do stuff and they have their own backstory and whatnot. And for that one, it's just like kill them early, join the goblins.
Yeah, well, what I'm going to try to do with the halfling is I'm going to try to just ignore the tiefling quest entirely as best I can, because I think it could still be done then with that approach, and it kind of fits with the kind of background, the kind of role play I'm trying to do with him. So I'm interested in the story that'll kind of unfold with that approach. But yeah, it should be interesting. The second playthrough is probably going to be a priority. Paladin is pretty fun. You just get to run around and hit things.
Yeah, Paladin's definitely considered one of the strongest classes. It just has such a great kit for getting in there and taking fights. It's a lot less dicey than some of the finesse classes where you can get one shot by the tough enemies.
Yeah, I actually, maybe it was a dumb idea, but I was curious what it would be like if I just did a pure AC build where I just tried to maximize the armor class. And that's been pretty interesting. It definitely elongates the battles because she's not doing as much damage as she would be if I were min-maxing for that. But yeah, having 26 AC, pretty handy.
That's a lot of AC.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, getting hit is not a problem, suffice to say. And you add in the heavy armor, which gives you, what is it? It subtracts damage from any damage done. And then you add in the warding bond, which gives you resistances to everything. Like, she doesn't take any damage, hardly. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
The trade-off, though, is that she's really shit against magic, especially magic that influences things like the mind, right? So spells like confusion or hold or whatever, quite vulnerable. So that's a problem. Kind of have to design the rest of the team to offset that, but that's part of the challenge. So it's been interesting.
Nice. Yeah, I just have a ranger, a monk, and a paladin so far that I've played. One thing that's cool is that you can respec the different companions in your party too, to just like test out different classes. So I think I have Shadowheart as a bard in one of my campaigns. It's actually really good because each of the main characters has unique voice lines for stuff like vicious mockery. So you can hear the different characters talk shit, but you have to be a bard to do so.
Yeah, you got to give Larian credit. You know, they had all of the voice actors do voices for all of the different classes, even though their characters were not really supposed to be those classes. Very interesting approach there. But you got to give them credit. They really went the extra mile there.
Well, I did get a few starting questions from chat before we got started. There's obviously the kind of ongoing issues that people want updates about, Ukraine and Israel-Palestine. I'm guessing you have at least a few notes on some of those.
I don't have anything new on Ukraine, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, the biggest news there that I remember is that there was a leading general in Ukraine who did an interview with, I think, The Economist. And he was very upfront and frank about, the status of the war, basically admitting that it was in a deadlock. And no, that's not the word, stalemate, that the war is in a stalemate. And that Ukraine's offensive had not made nearly as much progress as they'd been hoping for. And, of course, he kind of requested more Western assistance and whatnot. But the fact that he was open about just the nature of the war as a stalemate and the fact it would probably be a very long war was kind of new. The Ukrainian government has been kind of cagey about that. They try to stay positive and to try to frame the war as positively as possible. But, after the past year or so, it's become apparent that it's going to be a long, difficult war. And they need to set expectations accordingly because there's a certain degree of fatigue in Europe and North America about the conflict. People were kind of hoping that Ukraine would be able to turn things around a little quicker, but that was never likely to be the case. So Ukraine is trying to adjust expectations accordingly so that people are maybe less disappointed and a little more realistic about the war's likely course going forward. Because if they don't do that, the fatigue is going to get worse and people are going to start wondering about whether support is worth it or not. and there could be growing pressure to try to, cut aid and to try to force some kind of peace agreement, even though that's itself not very realistic.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, some interesting PR moves there. But that's about the only development. I think as far as like the front line, there's nothing new there that we didn't talk about last time. I think we did talk about how they crossed the Dnieper.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so they do have a foothold on the eastern side of the Dnieper, and they haven't really gone anywhere with it. But the fact that they're there at all, is perhaps worth talking about. Maybe it's a distraction. Maybe it's a substantive effort to actually retake Kherson. Who's to say? But there hasn't been any updates on that last I checked, so not much to talk about overall.
There was a question, it's more of a prediction thing, of will the Ukraine war end up like the Korean armistice?
Possibly. I mean, it's anybody's guess how the conflict ends at this point. Maybe there's a collapse by Ukraine, maybe there's a collapse by Russia, maybe there's a change in leadership on one or the other side that's more conducive to some kind of negotiated settlement. Yeah, I mean, there's any number of possible outcomes at this point. Nobody really knows. Right now, there is no real plan to end the conflict. Right now, both sides are just trying to enscone themselves as much as possible so that they can outlast the other, so that when there is some kind of fundamental change to the underlying calculus of the conflict, that it is ideally in their favor.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, if you quit fighting now, then that doesn't happen. At that point, it's just surrender, and nobody wants to do that. So it's just a grinding conflict right now, a war of attrition, in which it's a battle to see who lasts the longest. Which is not very sexy. It's not the kind of conflict people like. People prefer their conflicts to be short and decisive, but, war is never anything that is even remotely certain in terms of its outcomes. It's always defined by uncertainty, so people really should be more realistic about that. But yeah, it's entirely possible that a Korea-style armistice that just freezes the border along the front line is negotiated at some point. At that point, though, it does not. At that point, the conflict would not be resolved; it would be frozen. Just like the Korean War never actually ended. It's basically just a 70-year-long frozen conflict that could hypothetically start up again at any time. That's basically what would happen in Ukraine if they did, well, with Ukraine and Russia, if they agreed to that style of armistice. And that would not really resolve the underlying tensions, and people would basically, and when I say people, I mean just Europe in general and the United States as well, would perpetually be preparing and hedging against a resumption of hostilities. So that would pretty much enscone and institutionalize those hostilities rather than actually trying to address their underlying drivers and lay the foundation for some kind of resumption of peaceful relations, or at least normalization of relations. That seems pretty far off at this point, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, from the perspective of Ukraine, having a frozen conflict like that would be technically receiving a loss, because their win condition is just reestablishing their border where it was. I think that's maybe Crimea is up for debate, but that was theirs very recently, so it's still kind of a loss for them if the border stays at some kind of line where the conflict currently exists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they've lost territory that they had previously held before the assumption of hostilities in February 2022, especially around Donetsk and Lugansk provinces. And of course, about half of Kherson and Zaporizhia as well have since been lost since then. So, yeah, from Ukraine's perspective, signing an armistice right now would result in the loss of, I think, about 20% of their territory that they had held before the assumption of hostilities. So that's pretty unpalatable, politically speaking, for both the population and the Ukrainian government. And there's also just the sentimental fact that, people don't like the idea of any kind of agreement that results in their citizens having to live under the Russian government, which people, of course, do not have a high opinion of in Ukraine at this point. especially given some of the behavior that the Russian army has been culpable of in occupied territory. So that's also kind of a no-go. But at the same time, who's to say? Variables change. Ukraine's economy isn't great. Russia's economy isn't great either, but it's just larger. They kind of have the advantage of scale over Ukraine in that sense. Although, of course, Ukraine in turn has the compensating advantage of having support from pretty much all of the largest economies on the planet, which is a pretty nice ace in the hole as far as things go. But yeah, I mean, without getting into all of the variables affecting the political economy of Russia and Ukraine and how that factors into the balance of power in the conflict, anything could change that balance and tip the scales in such a way that one or the other actor might substantively try to pursue some kind of peace agreement, or perhaps just a ceasefire of some kind. Yeah, we'll see. I think the Rasputitsa started, the rainy, muddy season in the region. So probably there's not going to be a whole lot of fighting, I would guess. I know there's been fighting around like Avdiivka and then Kupiansk, but from what I've been reading, Russian gains there have been pretty limited. I mean, even if they do take Avdiivka or something, then I mean that's not going to mean a whole lot. The territory being fought over now in the hot spots along the front is like very small, and all of the gains by either the Russians or Ukrainians have been very incremental. So the rainy season, that was already true before the rainy season. The rainy season is just going to make that worse. So there's probably not going to be a lot of drama as far as big changes in the front line in Ukraine for the next couple months correspondingly. You can tune back in December, January, and things will probably pick up around then.
A quick reminder for the chat, you're going to flag the automod anytime you say killing and then an ethnicity of people, even if you're talking about other people doing so. Jeez, automod is freaking out today. The topics have been very violent, so if there are ever any like funny, silly stories, that might be good to mix in today. We need help.
Funny stories.
Yeah, we don't need to do it right now. It's just sort of like when you're...
Sorry, go ahead.
I was saying, it's like when you're driving your car and there's like a problem with some heat regulation. You're out of coolant or something and there's steam coming out of it. It's a bit of a hot chat tonight. So chat, if you can keep it at a reasonable level, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, the internet is unfortunately quite the wild place at the best of times.
Yeah, true.
Well, I was going to say, I don't really have funny stories, mostly just weird ones. And some of those are kind of morbid. I don't know if they would have the desired effect. Was there any other hot topics?
So there was a question about... Oh, yeah, I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly because I tried saying this word. So... Dagestan? Or is it Dagestan? Dagestan.
I think Dagestan is correct.
Dagestan. Okay. There was apparently an airport fiasco where they were running on the tarmac or something.
No, it was there was a flight from Israel there was a mob that formed that was angry about the violence in Gaza, and so they tried to kind of receive, I guess. They went to the airport in anticipation of a flight from Israel, and they wanted to try to, get the Jews off of the plane, and try to beat them or whatever. Yeah, I don't think they ended up finding anybody. I think they ended up deflecting the flight or something. I don't recall exactly. Yeah, it was a thing. There's been a lot of incidents of varying kinds targeting either Muslims or Jews in different parts of the world, depending on where the prevailing sentiment in a given nation lay in the Israel-Palestine conflict. And there was like that, what was it? There was like a kid here in the United States who was killed in that vein. Did you
Oh,
hear
damn.
about that?
I did not.
Yeah, he was like a Muslim boy, if I'm not mistaken. He was like 10 years old or something, who was killed.
By whom
So
and
there's,
why?
I think it was supposed to be retaliation for the war in Gaza or the attack on Israel, the raid, remember, in
Oh, yeah.
October?
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. So there's been some global tit for tat violence. Not a whole lot, but the scope has been pretty wide. So that definitely has people on edge.
That's the thing that's so crazy is that these are civilian people that you're taking out just based on the kind of body they got dealt. It's wild.
Well, people are dumb. That's just what it comes down to. They don't think deeply about these kinds of things. They just want to lash out. They're seeking catharsis, not knowledge.
Yeah.
Hence the manifestations of violence.
I know not everyone's into anime, but there was one scene in Samurai Champloo where there's I think he's like a mob boss or something, and he's called the Buddha as his nickname. And one of the things that he tries to do is de-escalate conflicts with a rival gang, because there's basically what he describes as a series of reprisals of you kill someone in that gang, so then they need to go kill someone in your gang, and then you got someone killed, so you have to kill someone in their gang, and it kind of goes indefinitely. And that's, as we've talked about, what's been going on here for thousands of years at this point, of both sides have valid reasons to be mad. That's a fact. You have valid reasons to be mad based on the violence that has been dealt to your tribe. So when does it stop? How does it stop? And what are the potential solutions? That was another one of the questions that we got from chat today, which was, is there a 2-state solution? Is there a 4-state solution? There were some people who were saying, all right, since y'all can't decide who gets it, then no one gets it, and it's just going to be empty land.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Yeah.
Well, look at it like this, asking if there's a solution implies that there's a problem. And if you look at the choices that both radicals in Israel and radicals in Palestine have made over the full scope of the conflict, over the past 70 some years, if not longer, they've pretty much always made choices that involve trading off inevitable future violence in exchange for some kind of short-term objective. And given that those are the people who are in charge, especially recently, of both factions involved in the conflict, violence is not a surprise. It's basically the desired outcome, right? It was the inevitable desired trade-off for various other objectives. For Israel, specifically for Israeli settlers, they want the land. And then for radical Palestinians, they want right of return. And violence is unfortunate, but if that's the approach that they're both going to take, then nobody should be surprised when there are violent outbursts, like Hamas's raid in October, or like the inevitable Israeli retaliation afterwards. So, as dire as the violence has been, this is what everybody wants. Like, this was the optimal outcome because everybody is getting something out of this, right? Hamas gets to pretend that they're victims, and to pander, to international opinion, to try to get people on their side and to try to undermine normalization talks between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And then for the Israeli far right, they get to use this as an excuse to continue to refuse to give any concessions, to give ground on the 2-state negotiations, or to basically do anything that doesn't involve just taking more land in the West Bank in particular. So, there you go. That's the equilibrium. That is what both sides maneuvered themselves into, and neither side wants to leave. Both of them live with this fantasy that if they just pressure the other hard enough with enough bloodshed, then they can break the will of the other side and they can force them to give concessions. And I think both sides have proven by now that that's not going to happen, right? We've used the analogy on here before, what happens when the immovable object meets the irresistible force. And, both Israel and Palestine have good reasons to varying degrees for their positions and have made very clear that they see any kind of substantive concession as being totally unsatisfactory. if not being an existential threat, as many people on the Israeli far right painted.
Slight correction, it would be more of an unstoppable force. An irresistible force just sounds like sexy to me. So.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Thank you for the correction.
Welcome.
I don't want to eroticize. I don't want to rule 34 Israel Palestine.
No. Just trying to make sure.
Don't get any ideas, internet.
Yeah.
Although that is a thing that
comic relief.
That is a thing that has happened. I remember there was a controversy in around 2010 where there was an Israeli studio. I don't even think it was a studio. I think it was just some individuals who made a porn film that involved Israelis and Palestinians having sex with each other.
Wow.
And there was quite the stink over it.
You're not supposed to like them.
Yeah, there was some upset people on both sides on account of that. Yeah, unfortunately, if there were more of that kind of spirit, there would probably be less violence in the region, but so it goes.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I had I think it was a psychology professor back in my first or second year of college, and basically their number one thing that they wanted to really drill into the students was human beings are more similar to each other than they are different from each other. But a lot of times people really want to define themselves by the differences that they have from other groups of people. But this can lead you astray in the sense of you'll sometimes over-focus on the differences, which can prevent you from finding common ground and seeing how similar we really are to each other.
Yeah.
So, yes, humans are different from each other, but they're also relative to kind of comparisons with other animal species. We're very similar to each other. We do a lot of the same stuff. We like a lot of the same things. So the sooner we can figure that out, the better. But it's definitely a work in progress. And there are a lot of people who do capitalize on the differences between peoples from a business standpoint and a clique standpoint and a political power standpoint. Because if you, as we've seen with a lot of the evil regimes in human history, if you bash certain demographics of people, you're going to play into those pre-existing forms of prejudice that people have and make them feel strong and tall and superior to other people, which is a really kind of dangerous and seductive line that people can manipulate people with. So stay safe, be aware that people do gain advantages from getting us to fight amongst each other, but really we're not that different. So can we just calm down? Thanks.
Yeah, that would be ideal, but unfortunately one of the things that everybody has in common is a predilection towards violence. Tribalism is itself a part of the human condition. So yeah, everybody should calm down for sure, but that requires a degree of enlightenment that is very difficult for broad swaths of the population to achieve.
Mm-hmm. I think the internet can help overall a lot of people around my stream, and I would say I'm included in this. We identify more with our activities and our hobbies than we identify with a particular nationality or political party. Like, I don't self-identify as a Democrat or Republican. I'm an American, you could say that, but it's not like I'm shouting USA every 5 minutes either. So that's it's an interesting slow shift of going from local tribal identities to national identities, and then eventually a global identity in some sense.
Yeah, that's a shift that is happening, but it's a slow shift, and it requires, generally speaking, and maybe this is the economic determinist in me talking, but that shift generally requires a not inconsiderable degree of economic development.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of places in the world that really struggle with that, and correspondingly, you don't really see that shift in identities happening very quickly or at all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it does happen, but it can be rough, and especially that transition from traditional identities to national identities can be very violent. Mm-hmm. Nationalism has a lot of merits to it, but it's not known for being a chill perspective on the world.
Yeah.
Nationalism has justified any number of atrocities over the course of the ideology's history. Now, I think India is a really interesting case study of that right now, actually, because India's level of development was very low for much of the 20th century, even after independence. But ever since economic reforms were implemented in the early 1990s, the Indian economy has advanced considerably to the point where there's a substantial middle class in India that was much larger than it had been in previous generations. And that new generation of Indian middle class, that new Indian middle class, has different ideas about the nation, the national identity, the kind of vision that they have for the future, right? It's distinctive from the vision that was held by the previous Anglo elite. Because pretty much all of the elites, the educated folks who ran India over the course of the 20th century, were largely sort of Anglophone and Anglophile in outlook. Largely English education and English ideas, history, etc., and etc. Sorry. And subsequently, the emergence of this middle class is the first significant challenge to that elite's sort of different perspective. There had already been some challenges to them already, not least, dissident factions within their own ranks. But the new middle class is a distinct new kind of challenge for them. And so they have really pushed nationalism in particular. And that's been part and parcel of the rise of Narendra Modi, the current prime minister of India, and the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party. So they've kind of really hung their hat, so to speak. They've really predicated a lot of their politics on nationalist politics, which had kind of been done before, but before it was more of a national liberation politics of the kind of sort of center-left style that was common amongst colonized peoples in the early mid-20th century. That had been more the defining nationalism. Now there's more of a conservative, culturally backward, well, I shouldn't say backward looking per se, but a culturally conservative, socially conservative nationalism that is less tied to traditional notions of European Enlightenment ideals and is more rooted into the native South Asian culture. So some people like that, some people don't, but it's certainly been the biggest, most dramatic change in Indian politics over the past 20 years. And that's exactly the kind of change that you're talking about, right? Because, before it was elites who were basically just trying to lead, broad swaths of a very traditional people who lived in a way that was not too different from the way a lot of their ancestors had centuries or even millennia ago, to the present day where you have a large middle class that is not elite, which has more of a national identity rather than a traditional identity. So how that plays out in India, I think, will be an interesting case study, not least because it's going to give you an idea of what's going to happen, probably anyway, in much of the rest of the world, because it's not just India that is making this transition. The global economic boom that started in the 1980s, 1990s, roughly, has really lifted a lot of what had been very poor countries into something resembling middle income status. And as that's happened, there's been an emergence of middle classes in all of those societies that have a similarly more nationalistic view of the world. There's been a corresponding emergence of people who also have more of a cosmopolitan view, but the nationalist view is almost invariably the more dominant and popular view in developing countries in particular. So how they navigate that sort of emergence of a nationalist ideal that is rooted not in elite politics, but in popular middle class politics is going to really define much of the 21st century. And I would remind you that it's a very important question, because if you look at what happened in Europe in the late 19th century, and especially the early mid-20th century, you can see how rabid nationalism can very much go awry, right? Europe literally murdered all of their unpopular minorities because of that trend. So if there's something similar that happened in the entire rest of the world, you would be looking at severe mass casualties.
Mm-hmm.
It would be a Holocaust on every continent and every civilization if it played out exactly the same way as in Europe. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but you can definitely see the stirrings of prejudice and a desire for a homogenous nationalization of the culture in places that are experiencing that tradition. And that is sort of the first step towards a kind of subjugation of dissident factions and groups that have traditionally been marginal in myriad societies. Again, India is an interesting case study because there's always been tensions between Hindus and Muslims in India. But before, nationalists in India had gone out of their way to try to incorporate people of all faiths into the national identity. The new nationalism, the Hindutva nationalism, does not have room for Muslims, not really. And so they've increasingly been targeted by prejudiced actors at multiple levels of Indian society as that nationalist tendency has become ascendant. So that's very much something to keep an eye on. If it'll happen in India, there's more than decent chance it'll happen elsewhere too, because other places are struggling with the same phenomena. Now, you could argue that this is an overly linear way of thinking about things. Just because it happened in Europe doesn't mean it'll play out the same way in the rest of the world. That's true. Who's to say how different countries will develop in the face of economic development? In general, I tend to kind of side more with the linear view just because I'm an economist. And economists, especially political economists, tend to have more of a deterministic view of economics. Not uniformly and to varying degrees, but in general, economics is seen as an important determinant and variable influencing the course of cultural and political and social development in societies. And there hasn't been too much variance in the cases we have seen outside of Europe over time. You look at places like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, or other places, maybe like the UAE, for example, not a whole lot of variance. They tend to be fairly similar in terms of the way they develop their government institutions, in terms of labor versus capital, in terms of social evolution, with the general trend being towards more social liberalization rather than towards conservatism. Populist whiplash notwithstanding, that trend does tend to hold. But that said, it could be that there are new examples that prop up that disprove that notion and provide, wholly new paths with
so what you're saying
choices.
is, as nations and peoples prosper and they have more capital, they also have the ability to educate themselves more on how not to be hateful and dumb?
Yes, or how to be more hateful and dumb if that is the prevailing mood. The point is that when you're in a traditional society, a traditional economy, the number one priority is generally survival, right? So politics tends to center around that. The only people that are not focused on survival in that kind of society are the elites. And sometimes they get caught up in shenanigans of one kind, maybe a religious crusade, or maybe exuberance of one kind or another. I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase, what is it? Lakes of wine, trees of meat. Is this familiar?
No, what's that about?
So that's an old Chinese idiom that dates way back thousands of years. I think it was from maybe the Qin dynasty. I think of the first major dynasty that unified all of China. I don't remember exactly though, so don't quote me on that. But basically, my memory of the story is that there was an emperor who happened to cross a very, very sexy concubine. And if you're the emperor of China in that period, and you find a sexy lady, you can kind of do what you want, right? So he very much tried to get in her good graces, right? So she, knowing the power she held over him because he was so smitten with her, started making increasingly outlandish requests of him, basically just fucking around, because at that point, why not? And one of the things she asked for, supposedly, so goes the story, is that she wanted him to fill up an entire lake with wine and to hang meat from trees on an island in the middle of the lake, so that anytime she wanted, she could be on the island and just have wine and eat meat. And apparently, he actually did that. Keep in mind, China at that time was the wealthiest empire on the planet, so it's not too big a stretch. Hypothetically, it is possible.
It could have been a pond of wine.
It could have been a pond. It could have, yeah, there could be some exaggeration there, but if anybody could have pulled it off at that period of history, the emperor of China could have. So supposedly he actually did that, and in turn, lakes of wine, trees of meat has become an expression in the Chinese language referring to abundant displays of wealth.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's different things that elites can do, in traditional societies beyond just survival. Religious crusades, ostentatious displays of wealth, whatever. But the vast majority of people are just focused on survival. Now, when you start economically developing, then you start getting choices. It becomes more at your discretion. That is to say, broader parts of the population have a choice and a voice in terms of shaping their society using surplus wealth, surplus food, surplus manufactured goods, etc. You've got all this power. What are you going to use it for? Now, historically speaking, like I mentioned earlier, generally societies that transition from a traditional society into a manufacturing society don't really deviate too much from the established pattern that we've seen in places like Europe and the United States. In general, one of the things that happens with a jump into manufacturing is that you end up with a huge labor force that is utterly dependent on wage labor, working in factories. And that represents a distinctive interest group that very frequently does not have much of a political voice, but also faces very dire conditions in that transition that frequently aggravate and radicalize them. So the most dominant, thus far, dynamic that emerges in this transition to a manufacturing society is tension between labor and capital. And that, of course, was the defining feature of the 20th century. But even in societies today that are making this transition, you can see that tension. It's just almost unavoidable, basically. So different societies deal with it in different ways. Some have been more socialist, even communist at times. Others have suppressed labor and just tried to exploit them utterly. And generally, societies have kind of gone a middle way, trying to balance out labor with capital to varying degrees of success. Now, after manufacturing comes services, right? A services-driven economy. And once you get to that point, that's when the variance really starts to show. Because once you get to that point, you're dealing with very large surpluses. Generally much broader swaths of the population are much more comfortable. And at that point, there's a lot more options in terms of how you can structure society. So for a good example of that, you can look at the differences between Europe and the United States. Both of them have roughly equal levels of economic development, but have taken very different approaches to structuring their societies. Obviously, the United States has gone with a much more laissez-faire free market approach, and Europe has taken much more of a social democratic sort of middle management approach to running society. And Japan, of course, has taken an even more of a statist approach, but also has had similar success with developing its economy. So, these are all just different examples of choices you can make, and it's an example of the variance that you can see. Japan, in particular, is interesting because they're, even when they shifted to a services economy in the late 20th century, manufacturing was still disproportionately important. But over the past 20 years, the manufacturing sector has been weakening in Japan relative to other sectors. And so Japan, in turn, has become more and more defined by non-manufacturing activity in its economy. And correspondingly, there's been some very dramatic changes in Japanese society over that time period. Not least of which is basically the end of the salaryman. There are still salarymen in Japan, but that type of position where you have lifelong employment, virtually guaranteed, that's going away. Japan's economy and its labor force are increasingly employed in much more insecure, shorter-term types of jobs that are much more similar to the types of jobs that you would see in places like Europe and the United States. And Japanese society is going to go through some changes on account of that, because historically, Japanese society has put a premium on stability and management of uncertainty over and above opening things up for opportunity by accepting more risk. That's just not historically how they've really chosen to run their society, but structural economic changes are kind of forcing their hand. So either they're going to have to make significant changes to try to restore the status quo while at the same time, embracing the economic changes that have happened, or they're going to have to just fundamentally change their society in order to reflect the new economy that they have. And, anybody's guess which direction they go. There's some signs that Japan is kind of opening up culturally, but there's going to be a lot of conservatives that don't like that. So there could yet be a backlash to that. So Japan also, like India, is going to be an interesting case study in terms of the effect of economic development on society. But again, all of this is just meant to underline the fact that once you get to a certain level of development, what you might call like the postmodern era, there's pretty much any given direction you could go in. Like there's no set path. The manufacturing stage there seems to be much less variance there, but there's a lot of variance with the last stage, the services sector stage. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so instead of stages of development for a human body, it's the stages of development for a nation, and how they have basically to move from one stage to the next, and you can't skip stages. So there's some level of predictability, but you said there are different angles of solutions you can take or methods for advancing from one stage to the next.
Yeah. I mean, again, you don't have to go like full socialist when you deal with the labor capital tension. You can also go the free market route or a middle route. So different choices for different cultures and preferences, basically. That's inevitable. And then after that, then it's anything goes. Like Japan generally has been pretty conservative. Once it reached that sort of services sector stage, the postmodern stage, they were still prioritizing preservation of their culture. And so, unsurprisingly, they tend to be fairly conservative even now when they have a developed economy in a fairly modern society, in so much as you can create a uniform definition of modern. Even that could be debatable over the course of the next 20 years. Yeah, there's a good article in Foreign Affairs discussing modernization theory, which is more or less what I'm talking about. And they offered a pretty good critique of modernization theory. So if you're interested in this topic, I definitely recommend you check out that article. Don't entirely agree with the conclusions, but yeah, there's definitely flaws in the argumentation. If you're curious, the main point of criticism is that there's basically too narrow a sample size of societies that have made the transition fully from traditional to manufacturing to services-led economy in order to draw conclusions about how other societies are going to make that transition. Thus far, it's basically just been Japan, Europe, North America. So, yeah, those are useful case studies, but how much can we really extrapolate those to the projected experience for South Asia, the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, et cetera? So, debatable, right? You could argue that those societies will take very different paths and will end up with very different manifestations of modernity.
Chat's asking if there's a definition for what a postmodern economic system looks like.
No single definition. It's just more open-ended. In general, the only thing that postmodern economies, in so much as you can call them that, have in common is that manufacturing is less important relative to the services sector. The services sector is a very, very broad category. It encompasses a lot of economic activity. And the balance of different types of services sector activity is unpredictable. There's no inherent reason that a society making the transition to a services sector economy has to have a composition of its services sector look a certain way. So here in the United States, it tends to be a lot more driven by finance. The financial sector and real estate tends to be disproportionately important in the services sector. In places like Europe, it's more professions. Not so much the UK. Obviously, the UK is more financial sector as well. So there is some variety there, but in general, just basically a postmodern economy is a is a post-manufacturing economy. There's still some manufacturing, but most of the employment is in non-manufacturing areas.
Gotcha. So a modern economy is manufacturing driven, at least substantially, and then postmodern would just mean after that stage.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And I would point out that economic development never really ends per se. It's an ongoing process. So the definitions of modern as manufacturing and postmodern as services are themselves very much defined by our experience, that is to say, the world's experience with economic development up until this point. As economic development continues, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, we may note different stages, or perhaps just total chaos. There may be no stages. It may just be a total free-for-all where once you reach a certain stage of development, you can shape your economy and society however you want.
Mm-hmm.
But regardless, yeah, like modern and postmodern are very much definitions rooted in the late 20th century discourse about modernization theory and economic development. That terminology and those notions are likely to change as additional developments unfold in the 21st century. Right now we're still early in the 21st century, so there hasn't really been enough to challenge the established nomenclature, but almost certainly we will get there eventually. There's just been too much technological development for that not to happen, basically.
Cool, makes sense.
Well, let me throw out the usual disclaimer while we've got some dead air here. It's a good time for it. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. More painfully obvious at some times than others. So if I ever say anything stupid, wrong, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. I enjoy the feedback we get on here, so participation by chat is certainly encouraged in that regard. I won't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. I invariably go back and review chat to try to look at the feedback and also just look at people arguing. That seems to be very common as well, but the feedback also is the most appreciated. So.
You're going to have an entertaining go after tonight, I'll tell you.
Oh, I don't doubt it. I imagine they're arguing about Israel-Palestine, right?
I would say that was part of what got the chat into a bit of a tizzy. Yeah. It's just really hard to talk about the conflict in a way that gets people to find common ground and be okay talking with each other, because kind of like you've said with the catastrophizing of how the conflict is described, a lot of people are taking super hard lines, somewhat similar to how people politicize the COVID outbreak situation, where if you don't have the same opinion that I have, you're super wrong and you're like destroying the world. So it's that level of catastrophizing where it's not just basically how people engage in the conflict itself. It's like certain interpretations of it are not allowed because my news people told me that your news people are so wrong that you can't talk. So it's definitely some murky water to be navigating in. So thanks, chat, for trying your best. I know it's not the easiest.
Yeah, I mean, Israel-Palestine is a really bad issue to get into if you're a partisan, because it's very easy to get wrapped up in the conflict. Keep in mind, both factions in the conflict are very, very media savvy. They're very smart about presenting a favorable outlook, a favorable image to the broader world, and in appealing to target demographics. Especially in the United States. The United States, in particular, has been targeted. So if you're an American who feels passionate about Israel-Palestine, I'm not saying you're wrong, whichever faction you may prefer in the conflict, but do keep in mind you are being targeted. It's no coincidence that there's so much passionate feeling there. Like, there is a very powerful, well-funded PR initiative by both Palestinians and Israelis to try to influence opinion in the United States. So all of the moving imagery, all of the passionate inquiry and debate, like, that is very much a product of that. That's not to say that there's not a lot of it that's genuine. There is plenty of sentiment for one faction or the other, but just be wary of it. Just be wary and aware of the fact that you are being targeted by an active PR campaign. And they've been doing it a long time, so they know what they're doing. It's not new. You can go all the way back to the 1940s and 50s if you want examples of that.
There's a track by a rap group called the Flowbots, and it starts off with the beautiful line, which is super true: there is a war going on for your mind. People want you to think certain stuff because if they can convince you, then they have power. They have more power than they had before. So a lot of people don't really realize the value of their own opinion, in the sense of that whenever you talk with people, you are changing the world in some capacity. Not all conversations are really deep or fruitful, and you don't always get to people, but to have an opinion represented is a greater than zero effect on the world. So whenever people are like really going to bat for one side or the other with their news, they have an agenda, and if they can sway you, then that's a win for them. So yeah, just be wary of the influences that you have. And like we've mentioned here during World Discussion, every news source has a bias, and that includes us. We haven't browsed all different news sources equally. We have some limitations on what we can browse, just because Agent Smith and I only speak English, and a lot of news is written in a different language. So we're going to automatically have a set of bias based on that.
C'est la vie.
Yep. So factor in the bias as you browse things, and also protect yourself from persuasion attempts from charismatic people. Just because they're charismatic doesn't mean they're right.
I should say so. Yeah, one of the things that both Israelis and Palestinians do is they try to put their the most favorable, recognizable, relatable people in their society to the fore. You know, Israel likes to put forward the secular part of their population as their face when dealing with the United States. And the Palestinians prefer to put their most, tread upon, poor, poverty-stricken people. Mm-hmm. But those people are not necessarily representative of either society. Like there's plenty of Jewish fundamentalism in Israel. In fact, the emergence of that fundamentalism has been one of the driving forces behind Israeli politics over the past 30 years. And the Palestinians, for their part, they are definitely oppressed to varying degrees. But just keep in mind, they do sell that oppression. Like that is a part of their strategy. It's not like Hamas, certainly not Hamas. It's not as though they're going out of the way to minimize casualties in the Palestinian territories. They know that violence sells, and so they try to maneuver and engineer situations where they can sell that, where they can generate imagery and propaganda where that is front and center. And I know there's culpability on one or the other side as far as feeding the other. That's also a factor. The far right in Israel feeds off of the far right in Palestine, and vice versa. They're two sides of the same coin. Keep that in mind also. They love to paint the other side as not wanting peace. They generally try to gaslight you into not understanding and realizing that frequently they themselves do not want peace either. There's a lot of fundamentalism and radicalism there underneath. You just have to watch for it. I would point out, too, that one of the most common problems I see in debates and comments, like on Reddit or whatever, one of the biggest problems I see is people talking past each other in terms of framing. Like it's very obvious that people who support the Palestinians and people who support the Israelis frame the conflict very, very differently. And I think that if people tried to understand those different framings, it would make a lot more sense why there's so much tension, and people would probably be less crazy about it.
What other questions do we have? Oh, here's a fun one. Are we at risk for a third world war?
That's a recurring question since we started this segment in 2017.
I would say this is a question we get about every 2 months, average.
Well, I guess to be fair, this is an exciting era to live in, so maybe not too surprising.
Yeah. The thing is, between World War II and World War III, and like you've mentioned, people during after World War I were saying, there couldn't be another world war. The previous one was so bad, that would be super dumb to do it again. And we did it again. So from our vantage point now, when we look at World War II and say, man, that was so bad, we would never do that again. Hopefully we don't do it again. One of the counterbalances to mass violence is as quality of life increases, people are less keen to put their life on the line for a war cause, mainly because they like being comfortable and they like being happy and being safe. So The wealthier humans get, and the more peaceful and prosperous their lives become, the more they have at stake and the less they want to throw that into the battlefield. Basically, going to war is a last resort kind of a situation. So obviously, if you're being invaded, that makes sense. But to go somewhere else and conquer stuff is a less and less attractive notion whenever you feel happy where you currently are. So relatively speaking, despite all the news that we get of these terrible wars and violence and these attacks and what have you, the per person violence on the planet is lower than ever before. And that's a really important reminder for people to put in front of themselves whenever you get into that doom scrolling, looking at all the really aggressive takes on what's going on. Is that's not really the norm. It's not the most common experience for people to be involved in violence. It's actually a rarity, but now we have it in 4K high definition video. So our representation of violence is a lot more clear and aggressively served to us, but the per person violence is way lower than it used to be in decades and centuries past. So I know it can be kind of depressing when you're looking at the news and that kind of thing, but there is a lot of hope. There are a lot of normal people who just do their job and try to live a peaceful life. So shout out to all of you. If you're a person and you have your day-to-day job, you make your best effort to be nice to people and try to understand the world and go about your business, you're actually one of the real ones and one of the heroes who's driving the world to be a more peaceful and habitable planet. So good job to you. Even if you didn't make the news from saving someone from a train track, doesn't mean you're not a good person, setting a good example and shifting the overall tone and flow of how the world is working. So I appreciate you.
Said.
Yeah.
Yeah, as far as World War III, pretty unlikely is my reading. You know, as feisty as the world has been lately, I don't think there's any underlying desire for some kind of broad-based global conflict. Really what we're seeing is a series of regional conflicts kind of flaring up at the same time. But there's not a whole lot of coordination between them. Russia, Iran, and Iran. I was talking to somebody recently about that. China, Iran, and Russia. People like to paint them as like these steadfast allies that are going to, attack the United States or challenge the United States, for control of the world or something. And that's not what's happening. All of these states have their own internal politics and their own objectives that they're following and pursuing very narrowly. And the level of cooperation between them on their respective objectives is fairly limited. It's not that important to China that Russia conquer Ukraine, for example, or that Iran becomes the hegemon of the Middle East, or vice versa, right? The Taiwan issue is not that important to Moscow or Tehran. So overall, in so much as there is cooperation, it's pretty middling. It's just more at the margins than anything. None of them really want to take big risks right now because largely they have their own internal problems to worry about above and beyond international ones. And keep in mind, authoritarian governments, including the ones in Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran, don't trust each other much more than they do the democratic governments of the world. When you're an authoritarian, mistrust and paranoia is the metagame, so to speak. It's the equilibrium. Mm-hmm. You don't really have a lot of choice but to be paranoid. So that kind of puts a cap on the degree to which you can really be honest and forthright with other leaders around the world. And that's especially so if there's another leader that you feel dependent on to one degree or the other. And certainly in Moscow and Tehran, there's a feeling that there's a danger they could be disproportionately dependent on Beijing. And being wary of that has made them hedge their bets to varying degrees, which is why there is no real alliance between them and China. There's always going to be a healthy distance between them, just to ensure that China never gains any undue degree of influence within their politics. And the Communist Party of China, for its part, is mostly busy just trying to keep a lid on China. I know people like to paint China as like just one country and that China's government is just another government among many, but size does matter. Like governing 1 billion plus people is different than governing a couple 100 million, or certainly, 10 million or whatever. A billion people is a whole order of magnitude more difficult. And the Communist Party of China has to spend most of its bandwidth on that activity, just managing and governing China. It is very difficult. And the fact that China's political institutions are not the best designed and not the most functional makes it even harder. So foreign adventurism is not likely to be something the Communist Party of China is really looking to do. It's probably, within the context of Chinese politics, going to be too risky relative to the potential reward. The only way I see it really feasibly becoming possible and likely is if it looks from the Chinese perspective to be easy. If reconquering Taiwan looked to be easy and without risk, they would have done it by now. And if it ever becomes, if they ever gain the perception that it could be easy, and risk-free, then yeah, they would do it. Like, why not at that point? It's all gain and no pain at that point. So those are the circumstances under which I would consider the possibility of foreign adventurism out of China. But that hasn't been happening. In general, Washington in particular is very privy of this reality and goes out of its way to signal to China that, maybe we wouldn't come to defend Taiwan, but if we did, we would fuck you up. Maybe we would lose, but we would make you bleed in doing it. And there's no telling just how badly that bleeding would be. And if you're a leader of China, again, a country of 1 billion people, and if you're the head of the Communist Party of China in particular, which is an organization that has, if I remember correctly, something like 60 to 70 million members, your hold on power, no matter how secure it may seem, is always going to be suspect. Because again, paranoia pays, right? And if you're in a party with 60 million people in it, you have a lot to be paranoid about. That's a lot of people who could be plotting against you. So you're really not looking to add risk to your portfolio as the premier leader of China. If anything, you're looking for the opposite. You're looking to mitigate risk. That's one of the reasons that Beijing, even as it's been signaling that it's really angry about Taiwan and it's upset about America and all this sort of wolf warrior bullshit, even as they've done that, behind the scenes, they've actually been very proactive and encouraging regarding engagement with Washington. The whole balloon fiasco kind of masked that delayed talks for several months. But since then, talks have been happening pretty regularly now, to the point where it's looking like Joe Biden is actually going to meet with Xi Jinping, which apparently a lot of people in Beijing aren't very happy about, but it is going to happen. And I think that betrays the fact that both governments are looking to mitigate risk right now, not escalate them. There's a lot of drama in both countries, and you can hardly blame them. But that fact alone kind of underlines my point here that Russia, China, Iran, Iran, they're not looking really to start big wars. They're looking for marginal gains that come at low risk. I've said it before regarding the war in Ukraine, like if the West had taken a harder line on Ukraine and just made it very clear that they were committed to come to Ukraine's defense in the case that it was attacked, or at least done a much more credible, thorough job of preparing Ukraine for a potential conflict, the Russians would not then have invaded. Or, of course, alternatively, if the West had just made it very clear that they didn't want anything to do with Ukraine and they did not consider it a core security issue for them, in that case, Russia probably would not have ended up invading because they wouldn't have had to at that point. Kiev would not have had a lot of great options. So, it's really more about perceptions of risk. For Russia, the perception was that Europe was kind of committed, but maybe not. Maybe they wouldn't do anything, so why not test them? Well, I say Europe, but I mean the West in general, North America and Europe. There was a perception that they might do something, but maybe not, so just test them out and see what happens. That's sort of the real culprit behind the invasion, as much as, if not more than, any other factor. Iran and China have very similar foreign policies in that regard. For an example of Iran, you can look at Hezbollah right now. When the whole Gaza imbroglio started recently, back in October, one of the common questions people were asking was, is there a possibility that this could escalate into a regional conflict? What's Hezbollah going to do? What's Iran going to do? Surely they're going to do something if they see all of these people in Gaza being killed. And, I said as much before, and I'll say it again, probably not. They're not that interested in Gaza. It's more of a symbolic issue for all of the major political actors in the region. Actually starting a war over it is a lot. That's taking on a lot of risk for what exactly? Like, supporting the Palestinians is easy. If you're the Iranians or the Hezbollah, you just give them some money, some weapons. It's a really small territory with a very small population. So it's a relatively mild investment. But actually starting shit with Israel, a potential tit for tat that it could escalate into a general conflict, that comes with way worse rewards and way more risks. So why bother? Like, if you're a Hezbollah and you've got all of these rockets that you could lob at Israel, okay, for one, is that going to stop Israel from invading Gaza? No, obviously. Anybody who knows Israel and Israeli history knows that they're not going to be deterred from retaliating against attacks like the Hamas attack in October. So Hezbollah's involvement is not going to save Gaza. Like, Gaza is pretty well fucked right now, pretty much regardless of what anybody does. So they're not going to save Gaza. Could they threaten Israel into giving concessions on something else? Maybe take some territory? No. The best they can do is throw rockets at Israel, maybe kill a couple hundred people, blow some shit up. That's it. Like, Hezbollah is not nearly strong enough to conceivably challenge the IDF for territorial control or to otherwise threaten the existence of Israel. Like, the most they can do is just be annoying, basically. Violently so. I don't want to downplay the loss of life and the relevance there, but they're not an existential threat like people seem to be pretending they are. And Iran similarly is not going to gain anything from that, right? If Hezbollah uses all of their rockets against Israel, what other deterrence does Iran have against Israeli strikes on nuclear facilities in Iran, for example? Like, that's their main trump card. And if they blow it now, then what are they going to use in the future, right? Hypothetically, they could rebuild that rocket stockpile in Lebanon, but that's going to take a while, right? And in the meantime, they don't have a lot of deterrence, and an aggressive Israeli government may see that as an opportunity. Also, keep in mind, Iran really does not have the power to project force into the Levant such that they could conceivably threaten Israel. Iran is definitely much bigger than Israel. I think Israel's like, 10 million people? And Iran is more around like 70 to 80 million people. So it's a larger scale. They have more resources to bring to bear, but they don't have a lot of ability to get those resources near Israel. And if they tried, the Israelis would notice and would probably prevent them from doing so. They've actually been doing that in Syria. The Iranian government keeps trying to build up its forces in Syria so that they could hypothetically project power from Syria, possibly into Israel. But if you've been paying attention to the Levant, or certainly the Syrian civil war, which I imagine a lot of people have stopped doing long ago, you would know that the Israelis have been consistently bombing Iranian targets in Syria over the past 10 years. They've never stopped. I read about it probably once a month. And there's probably more attacks that happen without people knowing about them. So the Israelis have been actively suppressing the Iranian presence in Syria. And if the Iranians tried to significantly build up forces, like, say, building up an army there that might actually attack Israel, they would be attacked immediately. Like, there's no question in my mind that a sizable buildup of Iranian forces in Syria would be met with immediate aggression by the Israeli government. So the Iranian government, I don't think, sees that as a viable pathway. Like, before they ever built up any sizable force, it would be destroyed. The best they can do is build up minor forces with rockets and shit. Basically an asymmetrical threat. But the whole thing that makes an asymmetrical threat asymmetrical is that one side is much more powerful than the other. And invariably, the Israelis have the power here. The Iranians, the Hezbollah, etc., they can threaten to kill Israelis, be they civilians or not, with rockets. But again, that is not enough of a threat to deter Israeli activity. And the rewards for doing so from an Iranian perspective or a Hezbollah perspective are just nil, because they're not going to get any real concessions from that. The only reason they would consider it is if the Israeli government sent some kind of signal, or maybe the Israeli society sent a signal that they might respond to violence by giving concessions, that they might fold under pressure. But again, if you know Israeli society or the Israeli government, you know that's not going to happen. Like, realistically speaking, they're not going to fold under pressure. They've been under quite a bit of pressure over the course of their history. I don't think they're going to break now because of a few rockets. As cold as it may sound, hundreds of Israelis could die from rocket attacks and nothing would really change, other than, the Israeli retaliation.
Yeah, I think we discussed a somewhat similar thing with World War II and the decision for the Nazis to basically start hitting cities in England. And that is not a military target, and it really just boosted the morale and the enthusiasm of the British people. So, yeah, attacking civilians just isn't a good move in terms of advancing your position in any way. Yeah, you can create some short-term fear, maybe, but at the same time, you also potentially galvanize the opposition without successfully hitting any military target. I think that's the thing that every side should be able to agree on, is attacking civilians is not a good way to go about war or conflict. And I understand that it's an asymmetric conflict and that kind of thing, but yeah, there isn't really a great excuse for attacking civilians if you can avoid it.
It can certainly be avoided, but in conflicts like Israel-Palestine, very frequently that becomes the objective.
Mm-hmm.
It sends a signal that you're serious, and it incurs a cost that the weaker faction in the asymmetrical conflict can feasibly incur that the other party will have to recognize and respond to. Keep in mind that you can make your society very secure from an opponent, but if you heap the pressure on that opponent over time, invariably they're going to lash out at you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to justify Hamas's violence. It was wrong, like, just very explicitly. But that said, as I said when we talked about it the first episode, right after it happened, there's a difference between ethics and expectations. Like, ethically, it's horrid.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the course of the conflict over the past 70 years, that's exactly what I would have expected them to do.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at, I guess this kind of goes back to framing, right? If you look at colonized societies in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, et cetera, et cetera, some of you have heard this argument like ad nauseum. So, bear with me. Some of you have not. So just for their benefit, like, a lot of societies were colonized by Europeans. And over the course of the 20th century, liberation movements evolved in those societies. And those movements almost invariably became very violent. And on the one hand, is violence ever justified when targeting civilians? Not really. But at the same time, if you don't have any other option, if you have no other viable path to pressure a colonizing force or an authoritarian government for that matter, or some other kind of force in your society that you feel powerless to resist, you should expect, not justify, but you should expect a certain portion of your society to lean on violence, to turn to violence, if you will, in order to try to push out that threat. And that's exactly what happened. Like, there was a lot of terrorism in places like Africa and South Asia. Well, maybe not as much South Asia, but Africa and Southeast Asia saw an immense amount of violence over the course of the period of the later periods of colonization and then decolonization after the fact. So yes, there's a debate to be had about whether violence is justified or not against civilians and whatnot. But historically speaking, the pattern is very clear. Whenever you see an oppressed people have a boot on their neck to one degree or another, invariably violence against civilians results. That's very predictable. So it's not really that surprising in Israel-Palestine if you frame the conflict as a liberation struggle. And that's exactly what a lot of people on the left do, specifically the left in the United States, as well as just people worldwide who generally affiliate more with the Palestinians. From their perspective, they see the conflict as a liberation struggle, just like the decolonization struggles over the course of the early mid-20th century. And while the violence against civilians is unfortunate from that perspective, it's also pretty much inevitable. And in that case, blame should be ascribed to the colonizer, or in this case, the Israeli government, which they see as the fundamental driver of the conflict and ultimately responsible for acts of violence, even those acts of violence that are targeted against them. Now, of course, that's just one framing. The other framing is that the Jewish people are themselves an oppressed minority and that they needed a place to go after basically everybody and their mother tried to murder them over the course of the 1940s. They literally had pretty much nowhere else to go other than this one place that Zionists in the 1920s had set up as a bastion and sanctuary for Jews. So unsurprisingly, that's where they all went. So from their perspective, yes, it is unfortunate that people were dispossessed of their land and whatnot, but from a realpolitik perspective, the alternative was staying in a continent that had just tried to murder all of them, which is not really a great choice. So between all of the bad choices they faced, Israel and the settlement thereof seemed to be the most preferable. And from that perspective, the conflict in Israel Palestine is existential. Like there's nowhere else for them to go. And they believe that if the Palestinians were to be granted right of return, and if there was a single unified state where everybody had equal rights, then invariably the Jews would be overwhelmed and there would be communal violence and eventually they would be expelled or exterminated. That's probably a stretch to my mind. I think that's catastrophizing and hyperventilating, personally. Certainly, there's a lot of radicals in Palestine who would want to do that, but realistically speaking, I don't think they would ever have the capability. But it's easy for me to say that as a third party. If you are actually living in Israel and actually are descended from people who fled various parts of the world because of violence against Jews, you don't really feel quite as prosaic about the prospect of living comfortably with people who hate you. You know, in general, there's a kind of, maybe this is a bad analogy, but there's a kind of beaten dog syndrome where if you subject somebody to enough violence, eventually they get really hard themselves. And after all of the violence that's been inflicted on the Jewish people, it probably should not be that surprising that they tend to take a pretty stern view of the way they manage things. So in the Israeli government, especially amongst Israeli conservatives, their attitude is, yeah, we do some bad things, but it's a shit world and you have to be tough if you want to survive it. And that's debatable. There's a lot of ethical debates around that perspective, but given the history, that's what I would expect. Like, I would totally expect people like those who settled Israel with the background they had to have that kind of worldview, given their experiences. So when you frame the conflict in that way, like, there's no way the Israelis would ever take a different tact than the one that they've been taking. Which is not to say that there has not been debate within Israel about different approaches. There's been liberals and seculars, obviously religious Zionists. There's even been communists. You know, there's been different schools of thought in Israel about the way to manage the problem of the Arabs, the Palestinians, the refugees. But in general, the consensus has been that, you know, if you do live in Israel and want to live in Israel and want there to be a Jewish state where Jews can be the majority, then regardless of the ethics of the Palestine issue, you have to support Israel and the Zionist project, because that's pretty much the only reason it exists. You know, this is one of the lines of argumentation that some of the first Israeli conservative thinkers, the early intellectuals in the Zionist movement in the early 20th century, came up with to justify the colonization. There was a big debate about colonization. Like, even before they started moving to Palestine, people were debating whether or not it would even be possible, given that there were already a lot of Muslim Arabs living in Palestine. And there were basically two schools of thought that emerged. And, you know, this is something I've been learning about recently. So, you know, people more in the know, please do correct me. But the two schools of thought that emerged, one of them was that colonizing Jews moving from Europe specifically would be welcomed in Palestine, since they would be bringing economic development, since they were skilled and educated workers and whatnot. And obviously that was a very condescending view, but it was also a very common view in that period of history. I'm talking like late 19th century, early 20th century Europe. Obviously, people in Europe at that time did not have a particularly tolerant view, shall we say, of people living in developing societies. So Jews were no exception to that in Europe. They also kind of looked down their nose a little bit at people in different parts of the world. So their attitude was, well, if we move to this place in Palestine where people are very poor and backward, They'll welcome us because the economy will improve and we'll give them more opportunities, etc. So that was one school of thought. The other one was a lot more hard-nosed. The other one said very explicitly, and this again was the conservative perspective, ironically, they said explicitly that if we go to Palestine and try to settle it and build a Jewish state, the people already living there will hate us, and they will fight forever to prevent us from doing that. There will be perpetual conflict if we do this. But even in spite of that, they argued that it would still be worth doing because there were no other options. They argued that if we're going to do this, we need to be all in. If we want to build a Jewish state in Palestine, we have to be hard. We have to heap pressure on our rivals, and we just have to keep heaping pressure until eventually they accept us and our presence here as inevitable and unalterable. And that kind of hardline approach is what they called, what was it, the Iron Wall? Let me check. The Iron Wall, that's right. And that's a strategy that's been at the bedrock of not only conservative Israeli thinking, but also quite a few center-left governments in Israeli history. It basically became the consensus approach. There's been different degrees on the margins that different governments have deviated on, but in general, the Iron Wall approach of just keeping pressure on them until they accept the existence of a Jewish state is the one that is seen as the most viable and inevitable. And again, this line of reasoning came very much from the conservative Israeli Zionist perspective. They had no illusions about the response that they would get once they started colonizing Israel. But again, that said, that more prosaic view that they would be welcomed as, developers and whatnot, that was actually the more dominant view for a long time. It wasn't until maybe the past couple decades that the conservative view really became ascendant. So there's different schools of thought there. But, again, there's a lot of variety. For those of you interested in that particular topic, I've been reading a book, and I'd recommend it, and I haven't finished it yet, but I've definitely enjoyed it thus far. It's called The Iron Wall, Israel in the Arab World, as written by Avi Schleim. I'm certainly mispronouncing that. Regardless, Mr. Schleim here is a historian, and the book here is basically a history of Israel since 1948, specifically its foreign policy vis-a-vis the Arabs in the region. I'm about 2 chapters in, and already I've learned quite a bit. It's been very illuminating. So strong recommend there, albeit an early one. So the point of this, to bring this full circle, was framing. It's from the Palestinian perspective, it's a liberation struggle, and the history of liberation struggles is one not only of idealism and gaining freedom, but also one of very frequently extreme violence that not infrequently targeted civilians. And then, of course, the competing framing is one of a Jewish people that are unwanted and violated all over the world, trying to create a bastion and sanctuary in the heart of the Middle East where they can feel safe, and that this is a desirable and justifiable thing to do regardless of the cost. And given that kind of realist, hard-nosed perspective, pretty much no chance in hell they're ever going to give ground. And maybe someday they'll get a little more enlightened and stop trying to settle land for bullshit religious reasons. But regardless, Israel is not going away. They're not going to quit. They don't feel particularly trusting, not only of the Arabs in the region, but really of anybody. So whatever agreement ends the conflict is going to have to recognize that reality. Like for them, it's an existential struggle. So liberation struggle versus existential struggle. Pick your framing. But given those are the 2 competing framings, it's no surprise that people debating this online very frequently flip out on each other. Because, from one perspective, they seem to be justifying the wanton murder of civilians. And then from the other perspective, it looks like the other side is trying to justify explicit colonialism and subjugation and dispossession of a minority alien people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say of the various topics and news items we've discussed, it's been maybe like top 3 most difficult to keep the chat calm. Top 3, I would say. Yeah. Maybe the start of the Ukraine war was another one that was really spicy, because around that time there was a lot of Russian propaganda as well that it was justified in some way, and that got me pretty heated, I'll admit. And then we also did have like a real person on the ground who's a part of our community, Bitter Sugar, who was giving us that like firsthand account of what was going on. So that was probably one of them. And then this one, I'm trying to think of another one that would be in the top 3, but yeah, definitely one of those topics where, because the situation is so extreme and because it's so long term in terms of all the different factors at play, it's basically impossible to have a quick, correct answer that people can agree on, even if they're similarly educated and even if they're all Americans. Like, we've got Americans yelling at each other right now, and they're not even over there in the situation, just because the information served to us is so intense and aggressive, and it's really hard to kind of listen to other people's perspectives without seeing people as taking the side of the bad guy. Who is the bad guy? There was some comments in chat that people were saying that you mixed up Judaism and Zionism. That may have just been maybe you mixed the terms up. I was getting cheesed by a Terran, so I'll be honest, I didn't hear that.
Yeah, not every Jewish person is a Zionist. And, really not every Zionist is Jewish. I'm sure that might sound odd to some people, but there are people who sympathize with the Jews as a people and support the idea of a Jewish state in which they can be the majority and sort of be safe and not discriminated against. But there's also a lot of Jews that are very critical of Zionism. Zionism, for those of you who don't know, is just the idea that Jews should have their own state, basically, in the Middle East. Or really any kind of majority state where they would be the majority. The fact that it was the Middle East was itself the result of some debate. From what I've read, alternatives included an island in the Pacific somewhere. They didn't have any particular island in mind, but just generically settling an island somewhere in the Pacific where they could have a Jewish majority society. And then another proposal was to settle on unsettled land in southern Argentina, since there was a lot of open land there. Obviously, it would have been pretty difficult to build a Jewish state inside of a pre-existing state, but that was the proposal anyway. They ended up going with Palestine. That was the more popular option. But yeah, there was considerable debate within Jewish communities in Europe about whether or not that was a good idea or even a feasible idea. I think some people in particular criticized it because it seemed to give credence to the anti-Semitic notion in Europe that the best way to deal with the Jewish problem, as it was perceived at the time, was to just expel them and make them leave. So having a bunch of Jews come out and say, actually, why don't we just leave, just kind of seemed to feed that argumentation, which kind of unsettled some of the people who were trying to argue against that line of thinking. So there's always been debate within the Jewish community, in so much as there is a single Jewish community, about the merits of Zionism right from the very start. And that continues right up till the present day. So yes, there is definitely a difference between Judaism and Zionism in that sense.
Yeah, I think Zionism also has like the biblical notions of a holy land given to them by God. And that's something that is definitely written about a lot in the Bible. And that's a thing that both sides basically have a lot of religious text that tells them that this is a good place to be. They have holy sites in these locations. So it's really, really hard to say, no, this is ours, you move, because they both have pretty similar reasons for staying where they are. That's what makes it so tough.
Yeah, Jerusalem in particular is difficult. From what I was reading in that book that I recommended, the original UN plan was that Jerusalem would be an international city managed by the UN, which would have been pretty nice. That would have squared a lot of circles and kind of saved some angst. But from the perspective of Ben Gurion, who was prime minister of the Yishuv, I think it was called, basically the Jewish government that existed within Palestine before independence, his perspective on the eve of independence in 1948 is that Jerusalem being managed by the UN was undesirable. He wanted control of Jerusalem. And so when the war broke out after Israel's independence was declared in 48, one of the objectives for the nascent Israeli government was to try to carve a path to Jerusalem. And you can actually see that very clearly in the map of Israel after the war ended. If you compare that to the map of Israel when the war started, when the borders were actually the EU, sorry, not the EU, the UN designated borders, you can see very clearly that the Israelis made a beeline for Jerusalem and cut a triangular path right to it, which is one of the reasons that the West Bank territory looks so peculiar even today. Yeah, there's an immense amount of drama in the conflict. It makes for fascinating reading. I'm sure it doesn't really make for fascinating living if you actually have to experience it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just for the demographics of my chatting community, I think just based on spoken languages and maybe development and just online gaming communities, I tend to have more people in chat who are from Israel than people who are from Palestine.
Makes sense.
Or even other Arab countries, just because I don't speak any Arabic language, and I think there might be less prevalence of fluency in English in the region. But I like my girlfriend's take on it. She's like, man, I wish aliens would just show up and just show us how similar we are to each other so we can get over all these squabbles. So we have some very different third party that shows up and it's like, oh, actually we're human now. But we're, I think, several hundred years off that for now. People are gradually getting more understanding and inclusive, but it's slow going.
Yeah. And it'll be a long-term project.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the feasibility might depend on backlash to cosmopolitanism, which seems to be very popular right now.
Just for a quick definition of what is cosmopolitanism?
Well, it's the root word obviously is cosmopolitan, which is basically outlooks in culture that are generally associated with urban living. And historically speaking, urban living has been more multicultural and diverse than in rural areas, which tend to be more uniform. Ports of call and trading centers generally have people coming from multiple different kingdoms, countries, etc. So they tend to see a lot of intermixing. And that's sort of that kind of lifestyle where you have lots of different people living shoulder to shoulder, encountering each other frequently, is sort of the root of what would be considered cosmopolitan lifestyles and outlook. And since globalization really took off as a major defining factor in the global economy and in global affairs a couple decades ago, there has emerged over time a kind of cosmopolitan elite, or perhaps a cosmopolitan outlook that is frequently embraced by people of a very particular class and perspective, that is maybe not quite completely uniform across the world, but shares many, many common characteristics, regardless of location. Somebody who's working as a computer programmer, for example, in the upper middle class in India probably has more in common with a similar such person in the United States than they do with somebody living a rural lifestyle, maybe an hour away or so.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just down to that growing single online, to a degree, community, or perhaps just urban community. In general, I would point out too that urban centers tend to evolve in a similar way, regardless of location. Urban living has certain commonalities across continents, across societies, etc. And so, in so much as those commonalities can help constitute and define an identity, people who share that urban identity can identify with each other and relate to each other to a greater degree than they can to people living in rural lifestyles, which can be very radically different. So between similarities in urban living across societies and a common online culture, which very frequently has very similar influences, regardless of society, there is to a degree an emerging global cosmopolitan class of people who share a common cosmopolitan outlook that is largely urban, more liberal, less conservative in outlook, certainly less culturally and socially conservative. And the emergence of that group of people is a nice development in so much as they all relate to each other and are friendly with each other, and that serves as a deterrent to conflict because they also trade with one another. But then the fact that this group is so influential and visible and different from anything that came before also tends to put off a lot of people who have more conservative sensibilities. And so that's resulted in a not inconsiderable populist backlash pretty much all over the world. Yeah, that backlash has varied in intensity from place to place, but it seems to be a common denominator, perhaps ironically. The conservative populists, regardless of country, like to point out that their nation's identities are being eroded and whatnot, but they seem to have more in common with each other than they do with any traditional identities that had existed before the rise of globalization. So ironically, the rise of global populism itself is a manifestation of globalization.
Gotcha. So basically, city's good.
Yeah, they can be. But the social changes that are unleashed by urban development and the economic development associated with urban development can be very wrenching. I don't know how much you've studied about the rise of the Nazis in Germany, but a big factor behind their support, beyond just being butthurt about World War One, was that a lot of conservatives in Germany felt threatened by a lot of the economic development and growing liberalization of German culture. And that created a lot of room for populists to emerge that were challenging that wanted to try to, quote unquote, fix that. And so that kind of conservative populism, to varying degrees, was not the only, but was a major driving factor behind the emergence and success of the Nazi Party in the 1920s and 30s. Yeah, economic dislocation and uncertainty tend to reverberate all through a culture and society, which tends to result then in radical politics. And unfortunately, radical politics can be quite violent.
True. Thank you, Trisha, for the raid. We are midway through a rather spicy world discussion. We're surviving it, though. There was a question that isn't necessarily a problem with any given country. Someone in chat was asking, is there a major negative consequence to people's declining attention span? Now people have an attention span now of 30 minutes or less.
I don't know. That's an interesting question. I think we would need a lot more data to kind of determine that. On the one hand, you could say it's objectively bad, in so much as a lower attention span means less ability to pay attention to, say, media that requires more attention. It takes longer to read it takes more than 30 minutes to read a book or to watch a documentary or what have you. So a lower attention span could mean that people have less willingness and ability to absorb information that is more detailed and intricate and offers a more nuanced take on various issues of one sort or another. However, you could also argue, alternatively, that shorter attention spans are not inherently bad in so much as they are themselves a product of a changing media environment. It could be that in the future, media and information, more specifically, is going to just inherently take less time to inject more information. You get more for your time now. And so having a lower attention span then could just be a reflection of that fact. You just don't need to have as much of an attention span in an era where you can absorb lots of information very quickly. So in that sense, it's not a negative thing, it's just an inevitable thing. It's a reflection of the changing way that we interact with information. But I would concede that that's an optimistic take. But again, it just depends, right? It's just going to depend on how people react to that, how people react to media, how people interact with their information, et cetera. Time will tell. Like I said at the start, we need a lot more data. It's going to be very difficult to project now how it's going to play out.
Another question for you. Does the disparity between the time and effort needed to be informed as a voter and the power of a single voter mean it's irrational to spend time on politics as a voter?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think the answer is subjective. That's something that everybody has to decide for themselves. Certainly, you could argue that given how difficult it is to become fully informed about an issue, that it doesn't really justify. That is to say, the investment in the time doesn't really justify it. Well, that is to say, the impact that your vote has doesn't really justify the time. So yeah, I could see that argumentation, but at the same time, not voting comes with its own costs, right? Like, very obviously at this point, it should be clear that not voting just opens the door to other people. I mean, I guess
People
the analogy,
who know less than you will still continue to vote. So
yeah, right. So yeah, it kind of reminds me of a conversation I had with a friend a couple of years ago. You know, I told them that I hadn't voted in a long time. And this is a friend from overseas, by the way, which makes it even funnier. So I told her, she asked me why I wasn't voting. And I said, well, you know, I kind of feel like a jerk and that I shouldn't really be doing that. And her immediate response was, why not? Other jerks are voting.
that's
And I
true.
said, well, I guess that's kind of a good point. There are indeed other jerks voting. Being a jerk doesn't seem to stop anybody else. So yeah, fair point. So yeah, you may not be able to invest as much as you like into becoming an informed voter, and your individual vote may not count for much. But the more effort you put in and the more you vote after the fact, the better the outcome will invariably be. Because it's not just you who does that, right? You know, if one person thinks that it's not worth it to vote or it's not worth it to invest time into becoming informed, then there's probably a whole lot of other people who are thinking the same thing. So the impact in the aggregate is going to be negative. So in that sense, from an ethical perspective, it would be better to do the thing that will have a positive impact if other people were to do the same thing. I think that's kind of a Kantian perspective, if I'm not mistaken. Somebody more familiar with philosophy would know better than I. But you know, the ethical thing to do there is to try to be informed. I don't expect anybody to necessarily be that successful. You know, even people who get into academia and invest a lot of time in learning the issues will frequently find that it's very difficult to come to solid conclusions. You know, in academia, very frequently questions do not lead to answers, they lead to more questions, which is not particularly cathartic in the grand scheme of things. But that's just the reality of the world we live in. So I think it's worth it to keep trying and to make the best effort. You know, try to be as informed as you can and to make the best decision you can. And I would point out too that probably the best heuristic you could use is just try to be a good person and try to do what a good person would do. You know, if everybody did that, you would have better outcomes. You would not necessarily have peace on earth, since of course lots of people have different ideas about what constitutes good behavior and what it means to be a good person. But a good faith effort in the grand scheme of things should be rewarded, philosophically speaking and politically speaking. So to not invest time in being informed and to just do whatever or just not to vote, that's going to have bad outcomes. And you know, there's plenty of historical examples to back that up. As bad as things might seem to be and as bad as the trend might be, that's never an excuse to give up. You know, the society we have today and everything that's good about it was built by people making an effort, not by people being lazy.
That's
and
true.
You owe it to, I would argue anyway, that we as the present generation owe it to future generations to pass on that boon as best we can. And that does require work on our part.
Yeah, I think another factor too is young people relatively participate in the political system less. A lot of times because maybe they can't afford to take days off, or because they're kind of they don't believe that their vote matters, which is another key factor. Older people tend to have a much higher rate of participating in the political system. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe it's because they're more likely to watch TV news or something. Maybe that's always been the case.
Well, I mean, really, it's that a lot of them are retired and have a lot of spare time.
Okay, that's fair.
Well, I mean, no joke. That's the main reason. Like, it's much easier as a retired person to just find the time to go vote, and also to get involved in politics and, you know, read the paper or watch the news, than it is if you're working 9 to 5 and are just exhausted at the end of the day.
All right. I've got an insane idea. Are you ready?
Hit me.
National holiday for voting.
That is a good idea, and we should do that.
Nice. Okay. Write that down, chat. National holiday for voting. Everyone loves days off. Everyone wants to feel like they make a better impact on their political system. And people who are poor and or working have a lot less time and energy to vote than people who are retired and have nothing better to do. So give us a day off and let us vote. I've spoken.
Yeah, I would concur. But I would point out, as a caveat, that that is not going to solve the underlying problem of the common working man not really having a lot of time to invest in doing background research into candidates, doing background research into issues, doing background research into the political system, etc. That's just kind of a built-in problem. Having a day off to vote doesn't really address that. But it's still a good idea. I'd still support that. But there's still going to be deeper structural problems there that perpetuate issues with the system as it exists now.
I think I had another question. Oh, yeah. Someone asked earlier, would a Trump presidency, if he is elected again, change the U.S.'s stance on Ukraine? Would there be negotiations with Putin, and or would the aid that we provide to Ukraine change?
So there are two answers to this question. One of them is the intuitive answer. One of them is the prospective answer. So the intuitive answer is that obviously it would change the nature of American foreign policy vis-a-vis Ukraine. Donald Trump has been quite vocal in saying that the United States should not be supporting Ukraine and that there should be some kind of deal, however you want to define that, with Russia that would end the conflict or possibly lead to some kind of conclusion to the conflict. So that's the intuitive answer. However, the speculative answer is that it's not inevitable that a Trump win in the 2024 election would result in some kind of immediate cutoff or immense pressure on Ukraine to cut a deal or some kind of American-Russian deal to try to resolve the conflict. Keep in mind that Donald Trump, during his first term, from 2016 to 2020, had a lot of schemes, had a lot of harebrained ideas that he wanted to implement vis-a-vis foreign policy. Some of them were better than others. I think everybody is pretty positive about the Abraham Accords. Less so about screwing over the Kurds in Syria and some of the other stuff, but kind of a mixed bag. Regardless, a lot of that stuff ended up being delayed indefinitely because of bureaucratic resistance, or alternatively was delayed or canceled or changed because people within the administration convinced Trump to change his mind. And even in cases where that did not happen, sometimes Trump was not able to implement his preferred foreign policy because Congress stepped in and basically forced his hand. As a side note here, for people not from the United States, you should know that between the three branches of government in the United States, the executive, the judiciary, and the legislative branch, they all have checks and balances against each other, but Congress, the legislative branch, is the most powerful one, and that's by design. The founders, the people who designed America's political institutions, went out of their way to ensure that the legislative branch, as the voice of the people as they saw it, was ultimately the final arbiter of the country's fate. So the executive branch has an immense amount of power and has been gaining power over the past couple decades, but even so, Congress has always been the more powerful branch. You haven't seen that much because there's been so much division in Congress between Republicans and Democrats. But when there's consensus on an issue, Congress can lay down the law. And there's not a hell of a lot the executive branch can do about it. And that's actually what happened with the Trump administration, much to my surprise. Normally when there's one party that controls both the legislature and the executive, generally the legislature kind of falls into line behind the leadership of the executive branch. But during the Trump administration, there was a lot of people that liked the idea of a Republican president, but didn't like the idea of a Trump president. And that resulted in Congress actually flexing its muscle quite a bit more than it had in recent decades in order to try to rein in some of Trump's, what were perceived anyway, as some of Trump's more exotic foreign policy ideas. So hypothetically, if Trump did win again in 2024, Congress could do that again. That is to say, flex its muscle in order to prevent Donald Trump from significantly curbing aid to Ukraine. Now, given how powerful the executive branch is, I don't doubt that there's other things that a Trump administration could do to mess with Ukraine. Maybe they wouldn't be able to cut aid, but maybe they could delay aid or obfuscate aid, or maybe cut a deal secretly with Russia, and just find other little ways in order to try to put pressure on Ukraine and help out Moscow in exchange for some kind of concession in some other area. But Congress, even in that circumstance, would have a lot of power to stop them, or otherwise influence the executive branch. So in that sense, my speculative answer to the question is that maybe not. It could be, even if Trump is elected, that America's Ukraine policy does not actually end up changing substantively in practice. But that could easily be wrong, right? It could be very easily the case that there's enough shift in sentiment in the Republican Party that should they win Congress, that is to say, should they win the House and the Senate and the presidency in 2024, they may decide that it's better to cut funding to Ukraine by a significant degree and try to find some kind of alternative outcome to the conflict beyond just supporting Ukraine indefinitely, in the hope that they can eventually grind out a victory over Russia.
So maybe, probably not.
Yeah, probably not. Probably foreign policy vis-a-vis Ukraine would change, and probably it would change in a way that involved less aid to Ukraine, but it's not inevitable. There could be congressional pressure to mitigate the decrease in aid or to stop it altogether, such that in effect the U.S. is maintaining the status quo. American politics has been very unpredictable over the past 10 years, so I don't doubt, well, it shouldn't be a surprise that the next 4 years is just as unpredictable, up to and including foreign policy.
So we'll see. It's next November, so a year from now is the presidential election.
Yep, 1 year.
Wow.
12 months till midnight.
We'll see.
Yeah, I think it's a sign of the times, and not a good one, that I kind of look forward to the next election with some anxiety. That's not really how you're supposed to feel about an election in a liberal democracy. Anticipation, sure, but not really so much anxiety. It's not supposed to be, oh, fuck, what's going to happen? It's supposed to be more, oh, well, what could change? Maybe things will get better. I don't think very many people view the upcoming election in that way. And that's not a healthy sign for any democracy.
Yeah. As an American, I do feel some level of embarrassment for our political news and the stuff that people end up hearing about. As a reminder, the loudest voices on TV from a given country are not necessarily representative of the normal people of that country. So, yeah, shout out to the honest folks just trying to do their best.
The bedrock of any civilization.
Mm-hmm.
Are we doing okay on time?
Yeah, I got about 30 minutes.
Gotcha. Well, any other exciting questions or debates?
I think we got all the ones from chat, unless there are new ones.
Gotcha. Ooh, excuse me. Well, I did have some weird stuff if you're interested in that.
Sure.
Well, let's see. There were 15 opposition ministers of parliament, that is to say, legislatures in Zimbabwe, who lost their seats recently. And by recently, I mean a month or two ago. Apparently, the Speaker of Parliament received a letter which was strangely full of grammatical mistakes of various kinds from a man who falsely claimed to be Secretary General of the main opposition party, the Citizens Coalition for Change. And in the letter, it was stated that the 15 members of the opposition party in question were no longer party members and hence no longer had standing to serve as MPs. Now, the letter was very obviously fake. Again, grammatical mistakes, and the guy who wrote the letter was not, in fact, the Secretary General of the opposition party. However, the Speaker of Parliament decided to ignore that fact and dismissed all 15 opposition members of Parliament.
Oh.
To which the opposition has politely requested them to reverse said decision, which the Speaker has declined to do.
Huh.
So the fun thing about that is because those 15 ministers of Parliament were removed, there's going to be by-elections. And the potential is that the ruling party, the ZANU-PF, could feasibly win control of the government, a clear-cut absolute majority, specifically a two-thirds majority, which would be enough to amend the Constitution, a majority that they currently lack. So the suspicion is, and maybe this is me being paranoid, but the suspicion is that the ruling party itself was responsible for the fake letter because they wanted to have those by-elections in which they could get that absolute two-thirds majority. If so, a hilariously simple plan that it seems has actually worked. Like something you would expect out of a Saturday morning cartoon, more so than an actual government. But Zimbabwe is not, alas, known for its good governance. I think I already talked about the prison in Venezuela, right?
You mean the luxurious one with the hot tub and stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah. This was a while back, I believe.
And did we talk about that soldier who defected to North Korea?
Yeah, the one who jumped over the fence or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you know that the North Koreans deported him back to the U.S.?
I did not know that.
Yeah.
Wow,
Yeah,
so he's that obnoxious.
Yeah. Yeah, that's been the joke. Like, even the North Koreans don't want him as a hostage. Let's see. So one of the unexpected outcomes, unintended consequences, if you like, of the conflict in Ukraine has been a crime spree in rural Britain. Have you heard about this?
No.
Yeah, so apparently because of sanctions, there's a shortage of GPS equipment for farm machinery in Russia. And as a result, there's a lot of demand for said GPS equipment amongst Russian farmers. And that in turn has led to the emergence of a black market in said GPS equipment. And a lot of that equipment being illegally moved to Russia to feed that market is apparently being taken from farmers in the UK, at least to the point where the relevant agency in the UK has been complaining about it. Apparently, it's something that's been happening for several years, but it's been particularly egregious since the war in Ukraine started. If you'd asked me in 2022 what one of the impacts of the war in Ukraine would be, theft of rural GPS farm machinery devices would not have ranked high on my list of impacts, but that just goes to illustrate how far and wide economic interactivity ranges. Even in a place like rural Russia, which you might not think is that connected to the rest of the world, actually it is.
Interesting. Yeah, I wouldn't have expected that.
I guess the last one I had here is particularly bizarre. So let's see, how do you tell this story? This is definitely a weirder one. So have you ever wanted to live off the grid?
I see the attraction toward it. As a gamer, that would suck because you would basically have to play single player games from then on. But in terms of not being reliant on larger energy grids or government assistance, I can see the appeal in some ways.
Would you want to live off the grid in the Rocky Mountains?
That's a bit of a hard sell. It sounds like a fairly inhospitable area, depending on where you are. You could be nestled in somewhere nice, but there are like bears and stuff, probably.
Would you want to live off the grid in the Rocky Mountains in an area that is not settled and has little to no infrastructure?
Probably not at the moment, no.
Yeah, that's a difficult setting, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what happened is that there was a family that decided that this is what they wanted to do. They actually picked up and they determined to go live off the grid in the Rocky Mountains, out in the boonies by themselves. And the reason we know this happened is because their bodies were found after the first summer, right? They went there during the summer, and apparently, near as they can tell, they died over the winter because they were very poorly prepared. When I say off the grid here, I mean like really off the grid. They were basically trying to be completely self sufficient, way out in the boonies. And they were not successful, unfortunately. And the result is that all of them died. And what was left of them was found several months later, like after winter had passed. Yeah, from
Damn.
what I was reading, they died of exposure to the cold weather. That's just how ill prepared they were for this.
Damn.
But the wild part of the story is that according to family members of this family, right, these people, they had no outdoor survival experience, and their only knowledge on the subject had come from watching YouTube videos.
Hmm.
Yeah. And yet they decided to make this very extreme step of trying to live like way out in the, raw, untamed Rocky Mountains.
Yeah, it's not a low difficulty first attempt at living off the grid. Because you
Yeah,
can basically live
exactly.
off the grid, but like close enough that maybe you're a half-hour drive from a gas station or something. And the more remote that you get, the more difficult it is for you to get assistance. And then another thing that, if you've ever gone hiking in the great outdoors, is if you don't have cell reception, you can't call people. I know people who live in cities might not realize that, but sometimes you don't have any cell reception at all, and there's nothing you can really do. I think there's an SOS setting on some phones where you can still make emergency calls or something like that, but I don't know how hard and set they were in refusing to use technology and that kind of thing.
They seem to have refused a lot of it. I can quote directly from the article here. I had two quotes in particular that are worth mentioning. First quote from the article: "It appears they attempted to construct a shelter, but had given up as winter arrived and instead spent time inside their tent." So they didn't even have a proper shelter for the winter. They were literally just trying to camp in the dead of winter in the middle of the Rocky Mountains.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty much challenge mode as far as survival goes, because the Rocky Mountains are not especially hospitable, especially during winter.
Mm-hmm.
The other quote here, they had a lot of literature with them about outdoor survival and foraging and stuff like that, but it looked like they bought supplies at a grocery store, end quote. So again, a lot of inexperience here, and they just kind of jumped into the deep end, and unfortunately, they didn't make it. And that was a really wild story when I read it. Like I thought maybe it was some people who went camping and then maybe they got caught in like a storm or something, but no, they, despite knowing nothing really about the subject, decided to just go live out in the mountains and then were just utterly unprepared for it. Like I could not imagine doing something of that scope based solely off of YouTube videos. That is some wild decision making.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Taking incremental steps toward that problem seems like it would make sense. There are absolutely people on the planet who could make it work, but those would be like seasoned hikers and mountaineers who know the landscape and they know what the extremes are going to be in terms of the environment. Anyone who's tried to connect through Denver Airport knows that Colorado is a shit show in terms of weather. That's one of the silliest places that I've been, just in terms of, okay, let's make an airport on a very high location that has tornadoes during the summer and thunderstorms during the summer and then blizzards during the winter so that everyone gets delays. The customer support desk there gets a lot of attention and action. I've seen customer support desks at other airports and there's just a bored person there and they can just browse their phone or something and they just don't have anyone to talk to. Denver Airport, there's a 4-hour long line of people to talk to, so it's never ending. So I can see how that would definitely be like of the highest challenge levels to try to live in the mountains in a place that has pretty extreme temperature swings. My parents moved to South Dakota, so they're definitely more so out on the frontier in terms of dealing with harsh conditions. They have temperatures similar to that where it can get to like 20 below zero Fahrenheit, which is extremely cold. That's like a really cutting, biting cold. And you need to have good shelter. You need to have a means of generating heat for yourself. You need to have lots of blankets. Basically just being able to prepare for not only what you think will be the worst, but imagining if things get even worse, like preparing for the absolute most dire scenarios possible. So word to the wise in chat, don't try to do stuff without at least getting some practice or some information from experts on what you should do. There are a lot of romantic ideals. There's the appeal to nature, that human life was better before we had big towns and big cities and that kind of thing. And there is the attractive notion of, yeah, you won't have people knocking at your door and annoying you and being loud and all that. That makes sense. I totally empathize with that. But we do have a lot of utilities and amenities that are afforded to us that we absolutely take for granted that normally take hard work. One of the ones that I challenge chat to be grateful for regularly is clean drinking water. Potable water. You can flip a switch and then clean water comes out. And yeah, maybe your city doesn't have the cleanest water, but for most cities it is drinkable and good. In nature, you have to boil the water first. You have to do extra steps to get to the same result. You can pay rent and have a structurally sound building most of the time. Out in nature, you have to build that for yourself and make sure that it's structurally sound, as airtight as possible, and can regulate your temperatures and what have you. I'm not really a seasoned outdoorsman, so I can't give you a guide on how to do it, but stay safe, do your research.
Exactly. It's definitely a big step, and like any big step in life, you want to put in the research.
Mm-hmm. Boiling water is also insufficient. All your homies who thought Neuro was serious. Actually, because I don't know all these things as not a regular outdoorsman, what are the other steps you need to do to make sure that it's good?
Yeah, I would have thought the same thing. I would have thought boiling would have been enough.
Well, boiling it will remove any living issues in it, like bacteria or parasites or whatever, so it'll kill anything in it, but it won't remove any concentrations of metals. So I guess that would be the thing to be wary of if there's like a bunch of iron in it or lead or mercury or I don't know what else could be in the water. But yeah, if it's a chemical like that, then just increasing the heat isn't necessarily going to get rid of it.
Yeah, fair point.
I think they have test kits.
Oh, no doubt.
You want to drink from a running river? Absolutely fucking not. That's deer poop, my fam.
Running river where? I don't think I would recommend anybody drink from the Trinity here in Dallas.
Oh, man. Yeah, true. It's brown. What's the holy river in India or whatever?
Oh, the Ganges.
The Ganges. Oh, man, that one is dirty and gross.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's it takes some balls to go bathe in the Ganges at this point, but it's a sufficiently holy river that millions of people still do it. Yeah, the Indian government wants to do a better job of taking care of it, but you know how it is with trade-offs regarding environmentalism. Right? You're going to trade off some of the environmental growth for a cleaner environment, and a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people in India are very poor and don't really like the idea of fewer opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, religious sentiment kind of helps with that. There are a lot of people who are very religious and want to clean up the Ganges just for spiritual reasons, but yeah, the weight of opinion tends to favor opportunity for the poor over that. You know, cleaning up the Ganges for religious reasons feels more like a luxury to a lot of people. Of course, there's health reasons to do it, which would probably have positive economic effects downstream, but that's not really how people think about it there.
Mm-hmm.
To be fair, it has been getting cleaner. It's still very, very dirty, but it is cleaner than it used to be. So you got to give them some credit for trying, at least.
Well, if you go back far enough to when humans didn't meddle with it, it was probably its cleanest state, relatively speaking.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
one
so
aspect of time that I wish more people thought about. There's the kind of notion that, I don't know, the way that we've talked about human living is very much focused on post agriculture because that's when we started writing stuff down. So that's a lot of the perspective on how humans should or have lived. But if you go back further, there were a lot of more primitive hunter-gatherer ways of doing stuff, and that had its upsides and its downsides, mostly downsides. But that's a big part of how our brains have evolved to function that people forget about. Is we're not really a creature that is naturally adapted to city life. It was more so a smaller tribe size of tens to maybe 100 people, and that would be a normal social group. And that's why I think a lot of the issues that we have with people's mental health and just their perspectives on the world are so rough and difficult, is because this whole mass media landscape that we exist in now is very, very unnatural. And it's really hard to feel like you're distinct from your group, but you're also included in your group. Having both of those things is really hard to balance for your average modern person. I feel like pretty much everyone either is slightly struggling to either define themselves and feel like they matter and they're unique, or they feel like they can't fit in. And striking the balance there is really hard, given that the world that we live in is very unnatural. It's very artificial in a lot of senses. The evolutionary psychologists and biologists, I think, say that humans have existed in a similar genetic form for about 300,000 years. That was the number Carl Sagan threw out. You could probably look up a more accurate number, but it was a very gradual set of changes that defined what we consider Homo sapiens to be today. And just kind of marking that out for yourself of, okay, that's 300,000 years of a creature that exists with the same genetics, but the pace of change of our lifestyle over the past 10,000 years is extremely fast. But it's not really talked about that much. So a lot of people expect others to be thriving and successful in this modern landscape, when really it's a pretty big ask to get these risen apes to drive motor vehicles and manage cellular phones and communicate with billions of people and try to feel like they're valuable and worthy next to the most successful people in any category. Because with the internet, you're not just competing with your local tribe of 12 to 80 people, you're competing with everyone who's in that demographic, which is a lot more daunting of a prospect than just trying to stand out in your tribe of a few dozen people. So I think there's room for some compassion that we can have and patience with each other, and just trying to navigate the modern world and just admitting like how different shit is now than it was in the past. It doesn't mean that things are worse. It just means that they're different, and we need to kind of acknowledge that we were not really evolved to live in this world. We're adapting to it, and that's cool. But yeah, it's very different times from the olden hunter-gatherer days, where you would wake up, sit on a log, maybe talk to some people, fart, go think about picking some berries, maybe try to hunt something and chase it down, usually fail at hunting, but then sometimes score, and then have a bunch of food for your tribe. Having some perspective in the time scale of human beings is pretty interesting. And also the scale of our population growth over time is insane. We have figured out how to sidestep natural selection, which is a pretty big achievement.
Yeah, that could have some interesting long-term effects.
Mm-hmm.
Like what kind of animal or what kind of human emerges over time if there isn't so much natural selection?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe we're just fooling ourselves about natural selection. Maybe the nature of natural selection itself has just changed, but is still in effect. In which case, we're just adapting to a new set of criteria.
Yeah. I think that was a lot of the frustration that Kukio struggled with, was the failure to acknowledge the scope of the world and how a lot of people have a very narrow perspective on things and they don't really challenge themselves in that sense. And I completely empathize with that. I think that's a big part of why people should be kind to themselves and admit that it's okay to be frustrated about things. There are things that you can do, but a lot of the issues with the world are not your fault in particular. So you don't have to carry the whole weight of the world. And also a friendly reminder to take breaks from social media. Take breaks from browsing news and media, especially if it's stressing you out. You are not obligated to read every article and stay up to date with everything that happens. In fact, if you do that, you're just going to end up tilting yourself too much, because it's just too much for a human to normally process. Like I was saying, the tribe size is so different that you're not even considering the problems of your local tribe. Like take, for example, the discussion that we had tonight. We've been getting really heated and saucy talking about a conflict that is so far from us. Most people who are talking about it haven't even been there. And that's something that wasn't even physically possible to argue about in the past. You used to have heckin' mail and printing presses and shit. And before that, it was just word of mouth. So remember the context of these discussions that we're having, and also try to be grateful for what you have. Like just to be able to browse news and to be able to play video games and talk with people around the world is really cool. So there's a lot that we can be positive about too. It doesn't all need to be trying to manage the doom and gloom of the world. There's a lot of really cool shit that we can be thankful for. So thanks to our forebears who gave us cool technology that allow us to live new and interesting lives.
Yeah. Well said.
There's my rant. We can find ways to be positive. If you struggle with that, chat, it's okay.
Well, not only can we, it's necessary. It's about the only way you can navigate a world of uncertainty. You know, if you don't know which way is up, ultimately the only thing you can do is try to be as positive, as good, as ethical as you can be, and hope that enough other people do the same, that eventually a new equilibrium emerges that reflects those values.
Yep. Yeah, some people they've mentioned other stuff like microplastics in the water and so on. And how we might be basically creating a different format of selection that's going to end up biting us in the ass, but it's a slower action than normally in nature. You have predators and prey, and you have natural catastrophes and that kind of thing that take people out. And that still happens, but overall, many peoples of the world are able to meet their basic survival needs of food and shelter. So once you have those boxes checked, what threats do you have to your species? And basically, the thing that's eliminating a lot of other animal species is habitat loss. And in a sense, you can also consider the habitat loss that we impose upon the planet ourselves, just by making water too dirty for us to use, nuclear fallout, areas that are like mined so you can't go there, like, landmines. Mm-hmm. Or even the other sense of we've actually been doing mining operations and we blow the side off a mountain to get some ore and that kind of a thing. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that we have to manage that are new problems.
Well, time will tell if we can juggle it all.
Mm-hmm.
Going to be one hell of a mess if we can't.
Mm-hmm.
But even if we can't, we'll probably end up surviving that too. Might be ugly, but we can probably pull through as a species, if nothing else. Certainly pulled through worse.
Yep. I have faith in humanity. Generally speaking, I'm kind of by demeanor an optimist, so I like to think that the good guys are going to win in the long term.
Well, given how revisionist people are about history, it's pretty much inevitable, isn't it?
History is written by the victors, yes. And the victors want to seem like they were in the right all along.
Yeah.
Another thing, too, since we're talking about human psychology and how it relates to the world, a single ape's brain is not meant to comprehend the vastness that is an entire planet's worth of life and discourse. So if you feel like it's tough to put all these pieces of the puzzle together and form a cohesive image of what's really going on in the world, that's okay.
Yeah.
And that's normal. And if you think you're someone who does understand everything that's going on, you are deluded. So
Yeah. Yeah, I've learned from experience that that is not something that any one person can do.
mm-hmm.
So you are very much right about that. It's a complicated world.
Mm-hmm.
What is it? 7, 8 billion people now?
Yeah. Actually, that makes me just want to look up what is the human population growth over time. The thing that's hard for me to fathom is how fast it's ramped up recently. Okay, I'll accept your cookies. How far back does this one go? This one goes back to 1950. Can we go back further than that? It was a century ago that there were 2 billion people. So we have 4x that amount. I think the population growth is slowing down relatively compared to that.
Yeah, it's starting to slow down.
Mm-hmm.
And it's projected to slow down even more quickly as we go further into the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
Did you see that India's population surpassed that of China recently?
I did not. Interesting.
Yeah. India's number one now.
Huh.
China's demographic slowing finally caught up with it.
Yeah, chat's pointing out that advances in medicine like antibiotics and vaccines have been a big part of why the population has grown.
Oh, yeah. Technology is the main culprit there. That's made it all possible.
Wow, the population 12,000 years ago was 4 million. How many? Okay, let's get a country example. What country has 4 million people?
Ireland? Let me check that. Ireland has 5 million.
Wow.
Let's see.
People are saying population models say that we're going to top out at 9 to 12 billion.
Yeah, I think that's correct from what I've read. I think we've talked about it before, but it's been a while, so there might be some people listening not familiar with the concept. There's this concept of demographic transition, and that refers to the transition in demographic growth that occurs as a country develops economically. So in a traditional society, there are very high birth rates, but also very high death rates.
Mm-hmm.
Not just among infants, but also just among people generally. So the result is that the net population growth is pretty low, which is one of the reasons that there's been very little demographic growth in the human species up until the past couple hundred years. What happens is that technology is then introduced that significantly reduces fatality rates, infant death rates, deaths from disease, deaths from famine, etc. But at the same time that the death rates are falling, birth rates are still elevated. And so the result is that there's a giant jump in population growth as that technological revolution is first introduced to a society.
Mm-hmm.
Now, then after that, eventually people started responding to the new technological society that emerges in the wake of that transition. And as we've seen in places that are considered economically developed, that response generally involves giving birth to way fewer children. So what happens is that once you reach a certain level of economic development, the birth rate falls back down to close to the death rate.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, the net population growth collapses again. Maybe not quite to the same degree that it was in the traditional era, but still much, much lower than it was during the population explosion that occurs in that middle transitory period.
Mm-hmm.
So this process of going from low net population growth to very high net population growth back down to low net population growth is what's called the demographic transition. And it's because of this transition and the fact that everybody expects it to happen pretty much in every society that's going to experience economic development over the next century that there is projected to be a decline in global population growth. It is assumed that every society will eventually reach the end of the demographic transition and will see their population growth return down to relatively low levels. Mm-hmm. And as a result, then, the expectation is that the global population will top out around, as they said, like whatever it is, 10 to 11 billion people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so that is the... Go ahead.
I just sent you an image that shows the population growth in the world population. You can see the world wars on it. Holy shit.
Oh, yeah.
Damn, what a jagged downward, and then the baby boom right after that.
Yeah, the world wars were pretty nasty business.
Shit.
That's the power of modern technology. And mind you, that was modern technology circa the 1940s. It's only gotten more powerful since then.
Yeah. Interesting.
The past 200 years have been a wild ride. And it's only going to get wilder from the looks of it.
This graph shows us topping out at population in about 2086.
Sounds about right.
So we'll be crusty and old, assuming we're still alive. I'll be 97.
Yeah, you might make it that long.
Yeah, I kind of had the goal to hit it to 100.
Yeah, you're taking care of yourself.
Be cool to see that far in the future.
I think I've had too many tacos to make it to 100.
Have vegan tacos. Are there healthy tacos? There are probably some healthy tacos. I like tacos too. Yesterday I had 2 Chipotle burritos.
Oh God, 2?
I had 2 Chipotle burritos, man.
Wow. Are you okay?
I did use the restroom multiple times, but I think overall I'm fine. Yeah, if you go all plant-based diet, the food is less calorie dense than if you have animal products. So in that sense, I can eat higher volume of food and not feel as bad. But I definitely, when I was getting ready for bed, was like one of those, man, my stomach is out more than it normally is kind of a things. But I do like burritos. They're good.
Alas, they are.
Can we all agree that human beings on Earth have devised some insanely awesome kinds of food? I think that's something that people of all ethnicities and religions can agree upon.
Indian food is very good.
That's true. I was telling people when they were asking about how we met and stuff and what you were like, because you're a fairly anonymous person when it comes to your online profile. But I did tell them that you're a foodie and you're not afraid to try international food that might be very different from American food. I remember there was a restaurant that we went to that had some like really weird shit. It was like an Indian restaurant. I ended up getting a vindaloo curry or something, but it had like brain was on the menu or something. So definitely have some interesting, what they call delicacies, or other people call gross.
Yeah, I did have the pig brain while I was in China.
Yeah,
I think I've told you about that before, right?
I don't think so.
No? Oh, that was when I was in Chongqing. No,
Hmm.
no, no, not Chengdu. Chengdu, sorry.
Hmm.
That's the same province, but more westerly.
Hmm.
Yeah, I went to a hot pot restaurant while I was in Chengdu, and I had, just to kind of try it for the sake of it, I ordered the pig brain. And that was weird. I was kind of expecting them to kind of spice it up and it would taste good, but instead, it was pretty much just a pig brain and soup. And the texture was just very filmy and slimy.
Hmm.
It didn't really have a good feel to it
Hmm.
going down, and it tasted kind of bland. It's almost like just sort of almost uncooked tofu, almost kind of like
Hmm.
that. Yeah, it wasn't really well seasoned. So I have had pig brain, but it was not the most exciting experience.
Did I tell you I
I don't
had
know.
natto, the
How did you?
fermented soybean? Yeah,
How was it?
yeah. See if whiskey wanted me to try it. It was sort of like um, bitter snot. Yeah.
Ah, that doesn't sound appealing.
No, it was nasty, but I ate it just because I'm a masochist.
There you
Chad
go.
is
That's the
asking
spirit.
if you've had shark fin soup.
I never had. Does anybody even sell it here in the U.S.?
No, I believe the mercury levels are too high for it to be considered a safe thing to eat.
Yeah, yeah. So no, I've never had it.
Yeah.
I understand it's more common in Asia, but I didn't encounter it while I was over there.
Yeah, one of the things to watch out for is whenever you're eating a predator animal that's going to have any of the bad stuff from the animals that they eat. And then, yeah. So basically, there are fish that eat smaller things in the water, including microplastics. And then if the sharks eat those fish and then you eat the sharks, you get all the bad stuff through the food chain. So, yeah, shark fin soup is probably not the healthiest item on the menu, if I had to say.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I'm sure it would be fun. Have you ever had unagi?
What is that? Eel?
It's yeah, the eel sushi.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that stuff's really good.
Yeah, that was one of my main go tos. They have like a bunch of dragon roll type things where it's like that and then avocado.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate that it's so expensive.
Hmm.
I guess that's what happens when the animal involved is endangered.
They're endangered now?
Oh yeah,
Oh,
they're
no.
hard to get. They're expensive not only because they taste good, but because we've basically eaten them to near extinction.
Oh, I was talking with my girlfriend about that recently about how the population of humans who have demand for fish is very different from the communities that actually live next to water. So,
Mm,
yeah, you've had people, not to call out JW, but you have people in Kansas who can now eat seafood, where previously that wasn't really an item on the menu. So you have demand for stuff that is disproportionate to the actual like location and availability of those creatures. So yeah,
yeah,
overfishing is definitely a
exactly.
big problem for that reason.
Yeah, that's simultaneously a testament to the power of modern logistics and the technology that makes it possible, but also to the lack of foresight as far as the impact that's had on a lot of the natural environment. But I guess I can't complain. I still eat it when I can,
Yeah.
albeit very rarely. Unfortunately, I no longer live up near Restaurant Row, where we used to live. I'm sure you remember that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, now I live in Oak Cliff,
Oh
which I
yeah.
think which I think may well be in a food desert.
Mm-hmm. You just got commercial stuff out there, the normal
Yeah,
chains.
yeah. Yeah, pretty much. There's been a small renaissance up in the Bishop Arts District. There's been more restaurants opening up there that are decent, but man, it's still nothing compared to Addison.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I still miss it. There's nothing like living up near a university, I'm telling you. Used to have a Mediterranean buffet, had a little hole in the wall Indian place I'd go to near the university sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Just a small little place that sold really good Indian food.
Mm-hmm.
There was an authentic Chinese place too. A client took me to once in lieu of paying.
Nice.
The offer was, I could pay for the proofreading and editing job, or I can just take you to eat at an authentic Chinese place. And I was like, yeah, actually, I would like that. Let's do the Chinese place. Lots of good places up there, but man, Oak Cliff, not so much. It's just a short hop and a skip from the ghetto down here.
I went to a Mexican restaurant in Oak Cliff with my viola instructor back in the day, and I have a very fond / scary memory of us getting the chips, and the chips are placed on the table, and then a cockroach just walks out of the chips off the table. And my mom was like, I'm not hungry.
Yep, understandable.
Yeah. Bit of an appetite killer, that.
Yeah, I don't blame you.
Yeah.
That'd be it for me, too.
Maybe not up to code with that one.
No. Then it does not surprise me that it was in Oak Cliff either.
Yeah. Believe it or not, chat has managed to calm down now that we shifted the conversation to food. Thank you, chat, for bearing with us through discussion tonight. And Agent Smith, you have quite the saucy affair to catch up on whenever I post the VOD.
Well, here's looking forward to it.
Yeah. Well, I should be good for next week. I'll be really into the streaming grind for pretty much all of November and into the first couple weeks of December.
Gotcha.
I will give you your usual weekly challenge of a 20-minute walk.
Really? You're going to lower it this week, huh?
Yeah, but I'll also give you the added challenge of trying to do 10 push-ups, and you can use your knees if you want. Just when he thought he was getting off easy.
There you go. I did meet the challenge last week.
Good, proud of you.
Well, actually 2 weeks ago, since we skipped last week.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, 30 minutes around the block 4 times.
Excellent. Well, thank you for coming on as usual, and thank you, chat, for contributing. And we will see you all on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah. Thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG. Nice.